As you're entering the Zoom meeting, good morning, rural water. Glad you could join us today. We are going to be talking about NPDES permits and PFAS PFOS. With us today presenting, we have Jess Vitale with Missouri Department of Natural Resources. She's the industrial permit writer and PFAS coordinator for wastewater. We're going to get the presentation started here momentarily. Make sure everything is in order. There's a lot going on. If for some reason you can't hear us, put it in the chat, and we'll be asking you to use your chat a little bit later. So I'm going to go ahead and switch what you're seeing on your screen. You should see Jess's PowerPoint presentation. Got that one coming in, John. Okay, I think we're going to turn things over to Jess Vitale.
Hi, folks. Great to have you today. I'm Jess Vitale. I'm an industrial permit writer and the PFAS coordinator for Water Pollution Control Branch. We got a lot of great stuff for you today. We're going to talk about NPDES permits or NPDES permits. We're also going to talk about PFAS from a wastewater and drinking water perspective, so stay tuned. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll try to answer them as we go along. I do want this to be highly collaborative, so please, if you have any questions, concerns, anything that just pops up, let us know. And first, we're going to begin by discussing NPDES permits. Next slide, please. So what is an operating permit generally for wastewater? Generally, it authorizes a specific type of wastewater treatment. So what's in your facility description is what you are required to and must treat to effectively. It's a compilation of most of the applicable regulations. This does come with a bit of a caveat, which is some regulations are self-implementing. So what that means is it doesn't matter whether you have a permit or not, you have to follow them. One that you guys are probably going to be the most familiar with is 40 CFR 503, or the biosolids regulation. We do incorporate that into your permit using standard conditions part 3. But even if you didn't have a permit at all, if you were an unpermitted facility, if you produced or land applied biosolids, you would still be required to follow 40 CFR 503. Your operating permit is going to roughly expire every 5 years. You might get a shortened permit because of your watershed. So the department is attempting to do a watershed-based approach to permitting for wastewater, particularly for nutrient trading, which is something that's going to come up very shortly. Most importantly, an operating permit is something that you should certainly read from front to back. We'll tell you which parts are the most important when we discuss that a little bit further after this presentation. It is very important that you're reading your permit. If you don't read your permit, you're not sure what you're supposed to be doing. If you have any questions about what your permit is, telling you that you need to do, or if something doesn't seem right, please contact your permit writer. Your permit writer should be able to provide you information about what you should be doing. If you have any questions, even if it's outside of the permit renewal process, your permit writer will still be able to help you. Next slide, please. So we're going to discuss the steps to renewing a permit, starting at the top. So every 5 years, roughly, your permit's going to expire. You're supposed to submit a renewal application within 180 days of expiry. So what that means is about 6 months before, you should submit a renewal application. We'll talk about why in just a moment. After we receive your renewal application, it gets assigned to a permit writer. We have a staff of roughly 10 to 15 permit writers at once, if we're fully staffed, which right now we are, which is wonderful. After that gets assigned to somebody, it usually takes roughly a month or two for that to get assigned. You'll receive a welcome letter within 15 days. If you've received a permit application, you've put it in for renewal and you haven't received anything from us and it's been quite a few months, please feel free to let us know. Could have gotten lost. We want to make sure that your permit application is getting renewed in a timely manner. That welcome letter is going to include information about initiatives from the department, as well as anything that may be missing in your application. So we might say the continuing authority isn't correct. Please confirm the correct continuing authority within 30 days. After your permit writer has sent you a welcome letter, they'll begin working on your permit. After the permit is finished, they'll send it for 10-day draft preview, which is an opportunity for you to look at the permit, ask any questions that you might have. After we undergo that 10-day draft preview, there is a required 30-day public notice. This is also true if you're doing a major modification to the permit. Typically, during a public notice period, we don't receive a lot of comments, but make sure that you know that you are still allowed to comment during this period. Lastly, the permit gets issued roughly for 5 years, depending on your watershed. Next slide, please. So we're going to briefly talk about the renewal applications and which ones are going to be important. As we said before, site-specific permits should submit 180 days prior to expiration. If you have an MOGD, MOG 821, or MOG 823, a general permit, you're going to need to submit that 30 days prior. The forms that you're going to need are either Form B, Form B2, or Form I. Every single facility will need to submit either Form B or Form B2. The difference is just how much your flow is. So if you have a flow of greater than 100,000 gallons per day, you're going to need to submit Form B2. That's going to be more of a long form. So that's going to ask you more questions about, for example, parameters that you've sampled for. In addition, if you are a no discharge irrigation system, you will also need to submit Form I. That just talks about what you've got going on irrigation wise. Next slide, please. So we're going to briefly talk about how you can get to those forms. This presentation will be available afterwards. So if you need to try to make sure how to get to those forms, we can let you know. So first, you're going to go to dnr.mo.gov, hover over water, which is in red, and then click need a permit or certification. Next slide, please. After that, you're going to click wastewater permits. You can either click directly on that text, or you can click on the image. Next slide, please. You're okay. Then you're going to need to scroll down on that page and click permit renewals. Next slide. And that'll open up a new tab here that has all of the different forms that you guys are going to need. There actually is a form missing from this page, which is Form E, but that's not applicable to domestic wastewater treatment facilities. After you finish those forms, you can either physically send them to us at P.O. Box 176, Jefferson City, Missouri, or you can email them to us via cleanwaterpermits@dnr.mo.gov. Make sure that you're using that as a plural, permits. And typically somebody will get back to you quite a bit quicker if you email versus if you send it via mail. Next slide, please. So as we said before, that welcome letter is supposed to be sent within 15 days of assignment to the permit writer. Please make sure that you're reading this email that we send you guys to ensure that there aren't additional requirements. So we might send you an email that says, hey, we still need some information from you. This form was not filled out correctly, or this form is missing information. Just to let you guys know, this is so extremely common. It's pretty much every form we probably have to say, you know, we need something else from you guys. And that's just because the forms are honestly pretty hard to read. There is a lot going on in those forms. And if you have questions or you don't understand what you need to be submitting to us, please let us know. We are always happy to explain that to you. Next slide, please. Again, we're going to be contacting you quite a bit via email. Make sure that whatever email address that you put on that application is one that you check pretty often. Things tend to move quite quickly as soon as that permit gets assigned, but it takes a little while for the permit to get assigned. Make sure that you're reviewing your 10-day preview thoroughly to ensure it's correct, and let your permit writer know when you're finished. This 10-day preview is a great time for you to ask questions, or if something doesn't look right, let us know. Permit writers make mistakes too, right? We don't know everything about your facility. And for the most part, you're actually going to know a lot more about your facility than us. You're there every day, right? So if something doesn't look right, let us know. This can be something as simple as, you know, previously we had grab sampling and now we have composite sampling. Why is that? That's a very, valid question to ask, particularly if your permit writer is requiring you to buy a composite sampling device. That's going to be quite expensive for you. So it is perfectly reasonable and encouraged for you to ask questions or tell us if something doesn't look right during this time. This is more of an informal period. So while in the next slide, we'll talk about how you can submit comments via PN or public notice period. This is considerably more informal, and this is generally when you're going to want to be saying, I see a problem here, or I'm confused about this. Something that's also very important to note is that you can ask for an extension on this. So say you have, your next 10 days are really, really busy. You've got a lot of stuff going on and you know that you're not going to have time to review the permit. That's actually perfectly reasonable. Just tell us, I need until, 20 days, or I need until April 2nd, or whenever you need. Generally, your permit writer is going to be willing to work with you. So effectively, all we need is a communication from you telling us, I need more time or I'm confused. Next slide, please. So permits are legally required to be posted publicly for comment for 30 days. So we post these on our website, and you are still allowed and encouraged to post comments during this time if something doesn't look right. It's considerably more of a formal period, so it requires us to send you comment response via mail, and it means that you won't be able to see the comment responses before your permit is issued. So generally, it's a good idea to contact us during that 10-day period, but you still are welcome to if something looks egregiously wrong. That website below is where we put public notices, and you should also receive an email from our admin staff whenever it goes on public notice. Next slide, please. So when we issue the permit, if there are public notice comments, we do incorporate that, and then the permit receives final approval. Anyone in the public is allowed to make public notice comments. It's very uncommon for the public to make public notice comments on domestic wastewater treatment facilities. Generally, this happens a lot more often with industrial facilities. But we do incorporate whatever comments we receive, and the permit receives final approval. Usually takes about a month or two in between the public notice period ending and the permit being issued. Afterwards, the permit is mailed to the owner address. So make sure you're using a good mailing address here. It's really not uncommon for people to put the owner address as the facility address. And sometimes you're not looking at the facility mail for quite a bit of time. So this could also be a problem if you put the owner address as City Hall. You know, they receive a lot of mail, so it's very possible that that's going to get lost. Make sure that you're giving us an address that you check often and that you do receive mail at. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the site-specific permit template, generally what it is and what it is not. This is how we write permits. So when a permit writer is writing your permit, they are not typing out every single word in the permit. It would take probably years for us to do that. It's just not reasonable. So what the template is a collection of common parameters and special conditions, stuff that for the most part, all domestic facilities are going to need. There are some site-specific considerations, like for example, 10 CSR 28 is going to have design requirements. Obviously, your design requirements for a lagoon are going to be quite different than they are for a mechanical treatment facility. The template is also used to facilitate a quicker permit turnaround. So it makes it a lot easier for us to just delete stuff from a huge template than it does for us to add a whole bunch of stuff. What the template is not, it is not the reason something is in your permit. We have to have a regulatory citation or essentially a law that tells us, here is what needs to be in your permit. If your permit writer cannot give you a good reason that something is in your permit, it might need to be removed. Generally, permit writers are not adding additional stuff in the permit template unless there's a good reason. There should always be a good reason for whatever the condition is. So even if you understand the condition and you're not confused by it, but you're not sure why it's in there, please feel free to contact us. We should be able to provide you a good reason for that. The template also is not the same permit everyone gets. Everybody's site-specific permit is going to be different, and that's going to be based off of what's going on at your site. There are going to be quite a few common parameters, but that doesn't mean that your permit is going to be the same as somebody else's down the road. Next slide, please. So let's review a mock permit. I've added all of the most common things you'll see in a permit here. Not every permit will have all of these, and some may have more. It's just going to depend on your type of facility. But effectively, we're going to look at the most common things that you're going to see. And if you could open that document for me. Technical issues, give us just a moment, folks. All right, and if you could just zoom in so that it's only one page. Or if you want to just give me the mouse, I can do it that way too.
Asking you guys, can you guys see the document that we just pulled up? Somebody put something in the...
That's better right there.
Perfect. Awesome.
All right. So we're going to talk about the very common things that you're going to see in a Missouri State operating permit. This is a site-specific permit. So this is not an MOGD. It's not an MOG 821. If you have questions about those, please feel free to contact me afterward and we can talk about that a little bit more. So generally what you're going to see on this first page is information about your facility. For this permit, the owner is the city of Lotta Waste. We're going to generally be talking about what's going to happen for POTWs, which I think that a lot of you are probably going to be coming from POTWs. Though I'm sure that there are some private facilities here as well. That owner is just going to say city of Lotta Waste. And the address should be whatever address you receive mail best at. That may not be a city hall address. Sometimes stuff gets lost by city administrators. If it seems like it's been a while since your permit should have been issued and you haven't received anything yet, let us know and we can send you that permit. Continuing authority, that's going to be one of the more important things that we're going to talk about today. So what continuing authority is, it's right here. It is effectively the same thing as ownership with just a couple of extra steps. The continuing authority is somebody that is legally required and must maintain and operate the facility. That does not mean that it's the operator, right? The operator is not the person that is legally responsible for the permit. The continuing authority is generally going to be the same person as the owner. If you are a private facility, whatever you put as the continuing authority must exactly match what is on the Secretary of State's website. So if your business name is Lotta Waste Inc., and you have a comma, you have to make sure on your application that you put that comma there. Has to be exact, including spacing and capitalization, as well as punctuation. Make sure that that continuing authority is correct. For the most part, that's generally what we're going to be asking for additional information on. So then you're going to have the facility name, which is just generally going to be, Lotta Waste wastewater treatment facility, Knob Noster wastewater treatment facility, and the facility address. If you have a 911 address, it's best to put that here, but sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes that's not an option. So what you can instead put is 0.25 miles from the intersection of Highway H and Z or whatever. Then we're going to look at this legal description here. So this is something that you probably are not going to know off the top of your head. We get it from our mapping. So we look at our mapping, we say, where's the outfall? That's what these coordinates are. Then we're going to discuss the receiving stream. So this is where the water is going to after you guys discharge it. Receiving stream is pretty important because it helps us determine what your effluent limits are going to be. If you have a receiving stream with a 7Q10 of greater than 0.1 CFS, you get mixing, which means that your ammonia limits are going to be higher. It's always best if you can, if you're trying to make a new treatment facility, to discharge to a bigger stream if you can. So then we scroll down a little bit to this facility description. Your treatment process must exactly match what is in the facility description. So in this facility description, it says the use or operation of this facility shall be by or under the supervision of a certified C operator. If you are a certified D operator and you need some additional time to get certified, there are some conditions that we can put into your permit to allow for that. What's most important here is going to be the line underneath that. So it talks about what treatment options you have. For this facility, they have a bar screen, extended aeration, 2 clarifiers, tablet chlorination, tablet dechlorination, aerobic digestion, and then they dispose of their sludge via contract hauler. Make sure that this exactly matches what is going on at the facility. So this facility description says, for example, that there are 2 clarifiers working. If you're shutting that clarifier down for a couple months of the year, you need to let us know because that's not authorized in your facility description. Regular operation and maintenance is not a part of this. So if you take the clarifier down for like a couple weeks because you need to clean it out, you don't have to change the facility description. But if you're regularly bypassing that clarifier, you need to let us know so that we can put conditions in your permit about that. The rest of this stuff is just information about how the facility was designed. So generally what the flow is, what the design population equivalent is, and how much sludge you're producing. If you are a POTW, you also will have an influent permitted feature. So this just says where you can get a dip sample of the influent. Particularly, the reason that we need this is because most POTWs are required to do percent removal for BOD and TSS. Also very important on this page is going to be the effective date and the expiration date right here. So this permit, the effective date is basically the end of 2022. It's going to expire at the end of 2027. That expiration date is really important because it's going to tell you, hey, I need to submit my renewal application 6 months before this expiration date. If you don't have a copy of your permit, we are always happy to send it to you. So even if it's not, renewal time right now, we haven't just issued your permit. If you don't have a copy, we are happy to send that to you. Please feel free to contact your permit writer, and I will show you where their contact information is in just a moment.
So Jessica,
Yep.
can you hear me?
Mhm.
So it doesn't mean you have to wait 180 days before your permit expires to send in your renewal. That means you need to have it in before then.
Absolutely. So if you want to send it in, a year beforehand, that's perfectly fine. It probably will take us a little bit longer to get to your permit though, because the expiration date is not for another year. But you need to have it in over 180 days beforehand. And the reason for that is when you submit the permit over 180 days beforehand, the renewal application, what happens is even if your permit expires while it's waiting to get renewed with us, you're still covered under that old permit. So effectively, your new permit is administratively continued. That's why we prefer you to have that. It means that you're not operating without a permit, even if we make a mistake and we're not able to issue your permit in time.
Thank
you. Do we have any other questions before we move on?
Sure.
All right, awesome. Please feel free if you have questions to put them in the chat. I want this to be highly collaborative, and I want to make sure that this is, what you guys need to know. So I'm always happy to answer questions. Please don't be shy on that front. So now we're at one of the most important parts of your permit, the part of your permit that you're probably going to be looking at the most, and that's the effluent tables. There is a lot of information crammed into this very small space. So we're going to take it top to bottom. Generally, the way that you want to look at this is like a burger. So you start with the bun when you're making a burger, and then you go to the meat and the inside. A lot of the time, what people do is they skip all this stuff at the front, and then they go, okay, I just need to know, what's my limit for BOD? So they skip all this stuff and they go, okay, I got 4530. That's all that matters. And that's really not the case. There's a lot of really important information in this table. So starting at the top, what this says is Table A1, interim effluent limitations and monitoring requirements. What does that mean? It means you have a schedule of compliance. So it means that up to a certain point, this is going to be your table. And then after that certain point, you're going to have a different table that's going to become effective. So for this particular permit, the text at the bottom after interim effluent limitations and monitoring requirements says the permittee is authorized to discharge from outfall numbers as specified in accordance with some regulations. The final effluent limitations outlined in Table A2 must be achieved as soon as possible, but no later than January 1st, 2026. So the second table that you're going to see when that starts is January 1st, 2026. These interim effluent limitations in Table A1 are effective beginning December 31st, 2022, and remain in effect through December 31st, 2025, or as soon as possible. So what that means is that this table right here, it's effective December 31st, 2022 through December 31st, 2025. After January 1st, 2026, this table is not going to matter anymore. You're going to have to go to the next table. That's really important because if you are not sure which table you have, you're not sure what your effluent limits are. So in this example, this schedule of compliance is going to be for ammonia as N. Generally, what we do there is that you have monitoring only up until your final effluent table comes into effect. So that means, you're going to need to know when your final effluent table comes into effect, because that's when you need to start meeting limits. It's also very important to look at several of these kind of columns that talk about what everything is. Obviously, on the left-hand side, you're going to have your effluent parameters, so your flow, BOD, TSS. But the second column is very important, and that is units. So not every parameter in your permit is going to be in milligrams per liter. Obviously, if you look at this permit, BOD is in milligrams per liter, so is ammonia and oil and grease. But look at total residual chlorine, that's in micrograms per liter. If you say that you have 100 micrograms per liter, you're technically in compliance with your permit, which is something we're going to talk about in just a bit. But if you're actually reporting in milligrams per liter, you could be unknowingly discharging a lot more TRC than you think that you should be. What's also important to note here is the measurement frequency. Generally, you're going to have all of your measurement frequencies kind of all put together. So generally, if you have quarterly sampling for a bunch of your parameters, all of those are going to be in the same table, while the ones that you have to do once a week or once a month are going to be in a separate table. You'll see here for E. coli, that is not the case, and that's just because this is a mock permit, and it would take a lot more tables to kind of put that out there. Also important is the sample type. So this tells you if you need to take a grab sample, composite sample, and particularly for flow, it tells you if you either need to take an estimate or a total. If you're required to have a 24-hour total, you have to have a totalizer. So you have to buy a new piece of equipment. Whereas if you have 24-hour estimate, you can kind of estimate that using your partial flume or whatever flow measurement device you have on site. So for this facility, this is a mechanical facility. The type of facility that you have is going to determine what your effluent limits are, particularly for the ones that are technology-based. I won't go too into what technology-based versus water quality is, but effectively the ones that are technology-based are already in regulation. So regulation says mechanical plants, 4530 for BOD and TSS. Ammonia is a water quality-based effluent limitation. So that's going to be based off of stream characteristics as well as site-specific characteristics. Information such as temperature and pH is going to be important here. Generally, when we derive ammonia values, we are looking at eco-regional pH and temperature. So basically, that's based off of where you are in the state. However, if you're trying to get a higher ammonia limit, something that you might do is submit site-specific pH and temperature data. Say that you have, a pH that's more conducive to less toxicity at your site. In that case, you would get a higher ammonia limit than if you were to just accept whatever eco-regional value. Also, it's important to note what a weekly average is and what a monthly average is. If you're taking one sample for an average, that's going to be your average, because what an average is you're adding all the values that you have and dividing it by the number of values. So you take one sample, you're adding, one thing, say that you get 30 for BOD, one thing divided by 1, you're still going to have 30. Why do we do this? The reason is because you can take several samples. So say you have a daily max of oil and grease of 15 and a monthly average of 10. So if you get a value of 20, you're going to be over your daily max, right? But you still might be able to meet that monthly average value by taking another sample when you might have 3 oil and grease. It generally does benefit you to take several samples. You are required to submit sample results for every sample that you take, but generally taking several samples is going to help you in the long run. There are also considerations to several of these parameters. So ammonia is going to be higher at certain times of the day. And especially if you have a lagoon, ammonia removal is going to be based off of effectively what the temperature is, how much sunlight you're getting, and how much wind action you're getting. In the winter, you're not going to get as much as in the summer. So those are some important things to consider. What you might also notice on this table is that there is nutrient monitoring. This is for facilities that are over 100,000 gallons per day. You will have both effluent and influent nutrient monitoring. Right now, we're having a little bit of a debate on how we want this to actually be speciated out. So if you take a total Kjeldahl nitrogen sample in and of itself, creates a hazardous waste component. So what we might be in the future deciding to do is requesting that you take a total nitrogen sample and then essentially subtract nitrite plus nitrate to get total Kjeldahl nitrogen. If you have questions about this, you can contact your permit writer. You're also always going to have pH effluent limits. So if you get mixing, you're going to get 6 for the minimum and 6.5 if you don't get mixing. Previous permits, I think some of them did not include a maximum. So if you're getting your permit renewed pretty recently, you might say, hey, I have a maximum. Why is that? There's a regulation that states that we have a minimum and a maximum pH. For dissolved oxygen, you might not see this in your permits anymore. And that is because this is actually an in-stream standard, not an end-of-pipe standard. And then lastly, a lot of facilities that are POTWs are going to have percent removal for BOD and TSS. A little bit below here, it does discuss in a note how you should be calculating that effectively. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But if you need help with the calculation, I do have a spreadsheet that does the calculation for you. It's just a really quick and simple spreadsheet. You just have to put your parameters and the values that you have, and it automatically does it for you. If you have questions or if you want access to that spreadsheet, please feel free to contact me and we can get that to you guys. And at the bottom here, it says monitoring reports shall be submitted quarterly. And it also tells you when the first report is due. So that means January 28th, that's when your first report is due. Every facility, unless you are Amish or do not have access to the internet, which is very, very rare, are required to submit via EDMR. So that means you can't send this stuff to your regional office anymore, unfortunately. You do have to get an account with MoDNR. If you need help with that, we are always happy to help you with that. And there's actually a helpline directly for that. At the bottom here, you're going to see these asterisms. So what do these mean? Effectively, you have to match the signs up. So you see over here where it has 1 per quarter, we have 4 asterisks. It's going to match up with the 4 asterisks down here. Just says see table on page 4 for quarterly sampling. Also very important to note is this second asterism here, a composite sample. So this will either tell you that a composite sample must be a modified composite sample, effectively meaning that you're taking several grab samples over the day, or if you're required to get a composite sampling device. If you guys don't have the money for a composite sampling device, which is very common, especially for small towns, you can absolutely request that you do minimum of 4 grab samples instead. So if your permit says you must have an automatic sampling device, takes 48 aliquots, you can ask for us to change that to be 4 grab samples. And then here you'll have your sampling table. This is really important. It does sometimes trip people up. So effectively for facilities that are not on losing streams, you are only required to sample for E. coli and the values that are associated with E. coli during the recreational season, which is from April through October. So if you're confused in, like March, you're trying to fill out your first quarter report, you say, hey, I don't have E. coli on my EDMR. That's actually on purpose. It's because you're not required to report them. It also means that you are not required to disinfect during that time. So you can save yourself quite a bit of money on disinfection byproducts, especially if you're doing TRC, by not disinfecting during that time. TRC and dissolved oxygen are directly related to E. coli. Obviously, if you're chlorinating to disinfect, that's why you're going to have TRC in your permit. Dissolved oxygen you may have in your permit because dechlorination chemicals have an effect on the dissolved oxygen of the stream. So effectively, they make it so there's less oxygen for fish to breathe when they're in the stream. Next, we're going to look at these notes. So these notes reiterate what I've already said. We don't expect for you guys to just know this. Obviously, because I write these permits very often, I already know that. We don't expect for you guys to know that. So all of these requirements are going to be in your permit. Note 1 talks about how effluent limitations and monitoring requirements for E. coli are only applicable during the recreational season. So only from April 1st to October 31st. And it's expressed as a geometric mean. What does that mean? Effectively, it means that you're going to have to do a little bit of math. Again, I do have an Excel spreadsheet that does the geometric mean for you. It's in the same spreadsheet as the influent monitoring to determine percent removal. If you guys want that, I can send it to you. It's a pretty quick and easy spreadsheet, and I can actually explain to you how the equation works as well. Sometimes you will be required to take an everyday or weekly sample for E. coli. It'll tell you in this note what's important for you to take. Note 2 is going to be very interesting, I would say. So TRC is a little bit different. Effectively, most instrumentation EPA can expect can only really get down to 130 micrograms per liter. If you have more sophisticated instrumentation, like you're at an industrial facility and they're doing this in-house, you might be able to get down to 10 or 20. But if you're using that Hatch colorimeter, you're probably only going to be able to get down to 130. Maybe, a little bit lower. It's going to be dependent on the method that you use. Effectively, what this note is saying is that even though the daily max limit is 18 right here, and the monthly average is 9, if you're under 130, you're good to go. So if you get 128, you're still considered in compliance with your permit. That explains that all down here. It says the minimum quantification level does not authorize the discharge of chlorine in excess of the effluent limits, and measured values greater than or equal to 130 are considered violations. Make sure that you're reporting whatever number pops up on that hatch colorimeter. So you don't want to say 130 every single time. If we see that when we're writing your permit, we're going to say, hey, I don't think that you're reporting this correctly. It is very common for facilities to be reporting incorrectly, and it's really no big deal. So if we contact you and say, hey, you're using the wrong units, or I don't think that you're reporting correctly, it's really not a big deal. We just want you to fix it moving forward. It's also really important to note that pH probes and TRC probes, they need to be calibrated pretty regularly. So you might think back, when's the last time I calibrated this probe? It'd be good to do it every single time if you have the opportunity. It's probably more reasonable because you guys are very busy to do it once a week or so. But make sure that you're calibrating these probes pretty regularly, or else you're going to get a value that may not make any sense. Also really important is this note down here. If no chlorine was used in a given sample period, an actual analysis for TRC and DO is not necessary. Simply report as AG conditional monitoring not required for this permit for TRC and DO in the EDMR system. So that means if you don't use TRC, do not report 0. Right? You need to make sure that you're using AG conditional monitoring not required. Note 3 discusses how you can effectively do the percent removal calculation. You don't have to take an influent sample if you don't discharge. So if you got nothing coming into the facility, you got nothing coming out of the facility, you're not going to be able to do that calculation. The formula for calculating percent removal is here. So it's average influent minus average effluent divided by average influent times 100. If you have trouble with this, if you're getting like a negative number or you're getting like a value that doesn't make any sense, talk to us. We can try to help troubleshoot and determine where you might have made a mistake. Math mistakes are really common. I feel like most people don't typically do math in their every day-to-day life. So we're absolutely happy to help you out with that. Other really important thing about this note, influent and effluent samples are to be taken during the same month. So if you're on monthly reporting, you need to make sure that your influent and effluent samples that you're putting into this calculation are both from January, for example. You can't mix months. So you can't say my influent from January and my effluent from February, because it's not going to be representative. Effectively, you're comparing apples and oranges there. This talks a little bit more about the equation itself. And it says how you need to collect the samples, which is composite sample made of a minimum of 4 grab samples. You may also have wet testing in your permit. So what is wet testing? What do these values mean? Effectively, what you're doing is doing a stress test on certain organisms. Generally, it's going to be a water flea and maybe a minnow, dependent on what type of stream you're discharging into. Effectively, you just bring a sample to the lab, say, hey, can you give us a wet test? Tell them whether it's a chronic or acute. And for the most part, you guys are only going to have acute wet testing. Generally, you're also only going to have monitoring only. For this example, we have put a limit of 3.3. Effectively, this is expressed as a percentage that we then turn into a value. You usually don't really have to do this. It should generally be on your lab sheet. If you have questions about wet testing, we do have somebody in-house that's their whole thing that they do, but you can also talk to your lab. Your lab is probably going to be happy to explain this to you and how it works. Generally, what we're looking at is where do deleterious effects occur? So when do the organisms start dying? When did the organism stop reproducing? That's generally what we're looking for. You're trying to see how long they survive in different percentages of effluent. You're hoping that they all survive. In addition, you're always going to have a note that tells you exactly when you need to be taking that wet test sample. So for the most part, most facilities are only going to have to do this once per permit cycle. But what if you have to do it like 3 times a permit cycle? It's going to tell you which years you have to do it in. It is very, very important for you to take that wet test in the years that it talks about. If you, for example, were to take a wet test in 2026, we could not accept that because the permit specifically requires you to conduct the wet test in 2027. There are additional considerations for wet testing you're probably going to have to discuss with your lab, but those are in special conditions. So for this particular permit, it's going to be in special condition 17. Now we get to influent monitoring. What is influent monitoring? This is effectively you taking a sample for before the wastewater goes through the treatment facility. So this is before screening. This is before any amount of activated sludge. This is before anything really happens. This should be right at your headworks. You want to make sure that your permit talks about where you're taking that sample. That should be on the first page of your permit, and it should be correct. So if the permit's first page says you need to take it from an influent manhole, and you don't have an influent manhole to take it from, you need to let us know. And also let us know if there is not a safe place for you to take this sample. Some treatment facilities are set up kind of weird, particularly for domestic facilities. It's not very common, but sometimes you have something like, oh, the influent is across the train tracks. It's not actually safe for us to go get a sample. If that's the case, let us know. We can work with you in that case. Your safety is the most important thing to us. It really doesn't matter, obviously we have to follow the regulations that are in place, but if that's going to put you in danger, we can find a workaround. Your safety is the most important. You guys, your job is so important to just society functioning. We're going to work with you if you have a concerns or something like that. So in this influent monitoring table, you're going to see a couple things. One, this facility is a POTW, so they're obviously going to have influent monitoring to determine percent removal for BOD and TSS. So you're just effectively taking one monthly average sample there. You're also going to have some nutrient monitoring, and that's because this facility has a design flow of over 100,000 gallons. You're going to have to take ammonia, phosphorus, total Kjeldahl nitrogen, and nitrite plus nitrate. Again, you might see some changes in your permit in the next year or so, as we're going away from actually requiring you to take a sample of total Kjeldahl nitrogen. That might become a calculated value. And again, that's because it produces a hazardous waste component. We generally want to avoid that as much as possible, particularly because domestic waste, we don't really want to mix in with hazardous waste. So this table is set up exactly the same way as the other effluent table. It just says influent. So this part right here where it says influent, that's going to be really important to making sure that you know what's going on. And of course, you have the same note as before. It says you're not required to take an influent sample when the facility doesn't discharge. It talks about how you need to be taking that sample. If you have a schedule of compliance, that information is going to be right after the influent section. So it's going to be right here. Talks about when you need to actually be having compliance. So for this particular permit, it's 3 years after the effective date of the permit. This also tells you what information you have to submit to us. So unfortunately, if you're on a schedule of compliance, you can't just do the work to get in compliance with the effluent limitations. You have to also let us know what you're doing. If this is something like E. coli, you might be telling us, hey, we're getting a contractor in to look at options, or we're installing tablet chlorination in the fall, or something like that. Every 6 months, you effectively have to submit a progress report to us. So it says within 6 months of the effective date of this permit, you shall report progress made in attaining compliance with the final effluent limitations for ammonia as N. For ammonia, this is kind of a different parameter, right? You might actually be able to meet ammonia just by making process improvements at your facility. And that's really going to be dependent on the type of facility that you have. For a lagoon, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do. Lagoon's a lagoon, you can add aeration. But as far as a process improvement or something that wouldn't actually affect what's in your facility description, you're probably not going to be able to do that for a lagoon. However, a mechanical plant, you can do a lot more. You can affect how long the blowers are on. I've seen some crazy solutions. If you have issues with carbon, for example, you can add dog food to your facility. It's really interesting, and the chemistry behind it is really interesting as well. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to reach out to your regional office staff. We're happy to help you with that sort of stuff. In any case, for your schedule of compliance, generally you're going to have to submit a progress report 6 months, 12 months, and then every 12 months after that. If you don't have anything going on, if you're saying, we're still waiting on the city to approve it or whatever, you can just tell us that. This doesn't have to be in any sort of specific format. It doesn't need to have a cover letter. I just need an email from you that says, here's what we're doing, here's what we're working on. We've, just ordered the parts for this sort of thing, or we're trying out adding, more blowers, or we're using the blowers for a longer period of time.
So Jessica,
What's up?
so who is it that we notify? Does that go in on our EDMRs, the progress report?
Yeah, that is absolutely right. So right down here, it says, please submit reports via the EDMR system. You can also request to send this to your regional office instead. So it's perfectly acceptable if you'd prefer to send these progress reports to your regional office. And sometimes that actually gets them in more. Sometimes what happens with the EDMR system is that we miss your report and we go, hey, you didn't send us the progress report. You go, I did, it's in there. So if you would prefer to send these to your regional office, that's perfectly fine. Please just let us know.
Thank you.
I will say, just in general, I think that this process should be highly collaborative, the permit. So I think that in the past, what's happened a lot is that the permit writer just says, here's your permit, deal with it, sucks to suck. I don't think that we should be doing that. I think that it's really important for your guys' input to be incorporated into the permit. If there is a law that says we can't do something, like if there's a law that says you have to have composite sampling, obviously we can't change that. But something like this, where the regulation doesn't require that the schedule of compliance progress report is sent, whether regional office or EDMR, that's something that you can discuss with your permit writer, whatever makes you most comfortable and what you think you're going to be able to meet best. This should really be a dialogue between the permit writer and the operator. I know that you guys are very, very busy, so that's why it's important to possibly request additional time during the 10-day comment period. This next little section is quite deceptive, I would say. So it looks like there's just a little bit of information here. Looks like it's just a really short paragraph, but there's actually pages and pages and pages of information in this short paragraph. Standard conditions. These are conditions that every single person is required to meet, regardless of what's in your site-specific permit. So effectively, standard conditions part 1 is for every single permit, and that's including industrial facilities. So even if you have a meat processing facility or you have a stormwater facility for metal finishers, they're still going to have part 1. Part 1 talks about what you are required to do as a permittee. Talks about stuff like your renewal application needs to be in at least 180 days beforehand. Talks about if there's a specific change in the facility description, you have to let us know. It is a really good idea to read all of these standard conditions, because this is a lot of information. Generally, your standard conditions are going to be attached as an appendix to your permit. Really good idea to read all of them. Part 2 is only applicable for POTWs effectively with a pretreatment program. What you're going to do for part 2 is you have to let us know if you have an additional industry that is discharging to your facility. That's obviously going to impact your effluent limits. So if you have like a landfill that's discharging to your facility, which some of you are unfortunately in that circumstance, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that might be a problem in our PFAS portion of the presentation. You're obviously going to have different parameters than somebody that just accepts domestic waste, doesn't have an industrial component. Standard conditions part 3 is related to biosolids. So all domestic facilities are going to have to stand by standard conditions part 3. It's going to talk to you about closure requirements as well. I know that facilities generally don't close, particularly POTWs, but sometimes you do have facilities that close down and need to know what you're going to have to do in the case that a facility closes down. Very important to note, standard conditions part 3 only applies to domestic facilities. So it does not apply to those meat processors, does not apply to metal finishing facilities, only domestic facilities. So this talks about also which version of the standard condition is going to be applicable. If you have an older permit that hasn't been renewed in a while, for standard conditions part 3, this might actually say August 1st, 2015. You need to be following the standard condition that is appropriate based off of what's in your permit. So if your permit says August 1st, 2015 for standard conditions part 3, effectively what you're going to do is find that version on the website. The 2019 version does not apply to you. You are also required to submit annual reports. Some facilities, dependent on your type of facility, obviously it's going to be very site specific there. But if you are required to submit a report via Standard Conditions Part 3, you do need to submit that in the EDMR system as an attachment. A little bit of information about attachments in the EDMR system. EDMR is not very smart. So EDMR is not like super complex programming, even though it can be a little bit difficult to navigate. EDMR does not know what you're submitting. So it can't just look at what you've submitted, look at the document and go, oh, this is a schedule of compliance progress report, or this is a sludge report. What you have to do is make sure that you look at the attachment type requirement and then make sure that whatever attachment you upload is called that. So if you're required to submit a schedule of compliance progress report, make sure that that's the attachment type that you select when you're attaching it. It could be a lot of the times that if you make a mistake here, we'll say, we never received your schedule of compliance progress report. And you can just say, hey, we actually did submit that. We just used like the incorrect label on it effectively. All right, any questions there? Good. All right, now we're going to get into special conditions. What special conditions are, why they're important, and what they mean. Effectively, special conditions are site-specific conditions that you do still have to meet. So unlike standard conditions, which are the same for every single facility that they apply to, you might have differences here. Generally, this EDMR submission system information is going to be the same for everybody. So this effectively says you are required by law to submit all of your stuff electronically to us. That's 40 CFR 127, and that is like a statute effectively. It's something that's federal, and unfortunately we don't have the ability to change, which I know can be a little bit frustrating because anybody that might have worked with the EDMR system in the past, it's a little difficult to navigate. One thing that I can think of off the top of my head is that through the EPA side of EDMR, you're required to change your password every 90 days. So if you're a facility that's on quarterly reporting, every single time that you're going into EDMR, you're going to have to change your password. There's some really good information in this special condition, and it talks about, like, effectively, if you have trouble, you can call us. The most important part right here is going to be this helpline. So if you experience difficulties using the system, contact us either via that email or call those phone numbers. We have staff members on site every single day that are willing to help you with this. Please keep in mind, please be a little bit patient with them. This is not their primary role. So this is, effectively, we have like a rotating shift of permit writers. Anybody that's working at the DNR, as a permit writer might receive a call like this. You might even call me, and you might even call this line and talk to me effectively. So please be patient with these people. This is not their primary responsibility, and they're trying their best. I know the EDMR can be pretty difficult sometimes. So if you have any questions or you need help, we're always happy to help you. A lot of people see Part C and they think, oh, this is going to be me for sure. Waivers from electronic reporting. Unfortunately, the only waivers that we can provide are if you're Amish or Mennonite, as in it's against your religion to use a computer, or if effectively broadband systems are not available where you're at, which is very, very, very uncommon. You could also request this if you have, for example, a medical concern. So some people find it very difficult to look at a screen, or they might be partially blind. If that's you, we're willing to work with you in those cases. But for the most part, generally, you actually are really going to need to be using MoGem to submit your EDMR results. All right, number 2. The full implementation of this operating permit, which includes schedules of compliance, shall constitute compliance with all applicable federal and state statutes. So that means if you're following your permit, you're good to go. Your permit should be telling you every single thing you have to do, which is why it's important to read the permit. The second, or I guess like the most smallest one here is, however, this permit may be reopened and modified or alternatively revoked and issued. So that is if there is a difference in effluent standard or limitation, there is something more stringent that we need to add to your permit, or there's a pollutant that's in your permit that's not being limited. So for example, say you do phosphorus removal, you're probably going to have aluminum or iron in your permit. And that's because generally, when you're doing phosphorus removal, those are the salts that you're going to be using. Additionally, if you're a POTW and you don't have a pretreatment program, but you're starting to get one, particularly if perhaps you need to have a pretreatment program for PFAS, you need to let us know so that we can add that to your permit. If you're going to incorporate a new pretreatment program, that's something you're going to have to work with us on. Number 3 just says all outfalls must be clearly marked in the field. So you have to have a sign on your outfall that says outfall 1, outfall 2. For influent features, generally, we don't require this. We used to require this on land application facilities, but I don't think that we do anymore. I think that for land application fields, that doesn't need to be marked anymore. Obviously, make sure that what's in your permit matches that. It's very common for us to have kind of arguments or debates about what parts of the permit are important and what we should delete. So not every single permit is going to have these conditions in it. You might have relics of old policies that we had. Make sure that you're reading your permit to determine what you need to be doing. Number 4, report as no discharge when a discharge does not occur. What does that mean? It doesn't mean you went to the facility and checked it one time, and when you checked it, there was nothing going on. Unfortunately, this is something that EPA has told us, which is if the facility discharges at all during the quarter or month or whenever the compliance period is, you have to take a sample. Sometimes what we see is that facilities will say that they've not discharged in like 5 to 10 years, which is not physically possible. Even if you're not receiving any influent flow at all, Missouri is rain positive in every single county. And what that means is effectively, the facility is going to discharge even if there's no influent just from rainfall. So if we're seeing, 5 to 10 years of DMRs that say no discharge, we might start asking you, how often are you going out to the facility? Do we need to increase the monitoring frequency? Unfortunately, this is something that EPA has dinged us on in our review or their review of us. So this is something that's really important for you guys. Number 5 talks about the reporting of non-detects. And this is really important stuff here. It's not going to be the same for every parameter. And this special condition discusses how you should be doing that. So an analysis conducted by the permittee or the laboratory shall be conducted in a way that the precision and accuracy of the analyzed result can be enumerated. Effectively, that means you have to use the right methods. You can't just use whatever method that you want. There is a process for like adding methods, but particularly generally, you're going to be wanting to use 40 CFR 136 and only using the methods that are in there. Effectively, anything that is like already approved, anything that you guys are familiar with is probably approved. You also have to use sufficiently sensitive test methods as required in Standard Conditions Part 1, Section A, number 4. So you have to make sure that the test method can get down low enough for it to work. This might be a problem for facilities that have like lead testing, for example. PACE Analytical's minimum level is 5. So the lowest value that they can confidently report is 5 micrograms per liter. And oftentimes in your permit, your limit is 5 micrograms per liter. If your lab is not able to do a sufficiently sensitive test method, you may have to switch labs, unfortunately. Additionally, the permittee shall not report a sample result as non-detect without also reporting the minimum method level of the test. So effectively, when you report non-detect, the way that it looks is less than 130, less than 5. For oil and grease, generally it's going to be like less than 4.9, less than 5. If you don't report that minimum level, it's a failure to report, which is a violation. The way that you report that as required by a D is you shall provide the non-detect sample result using the less than symbol and the method minimum level. So that's less than 50 micrograms per liter if the method minimum level is 50. Where the permit contains a department-determined minimum quantification level and the permittee is granted authority in the permit to report 0 in lieu of the less than for a specific parameter, then report 0. This is really uncommon. For most parameters, you're not going to see this. For daily maximum, you shall report the highest value. If the highest value is non-detect, then you're just going to proceed as typical for non-detect values. Daily maximum is always going to be whatever the highest value is, even if you took several different samples. If you are reporting an average based on all non-detected values, you're going to have to effectively make an average, right? So an average is, again, adding all the values that you have, dividing by how many values you have. So if you're trying to make an average and you have all non-detect values, remove that symbol, that less than symbol, average the values, and then add it back at the end. If you're reporting an average based on a mix of detected and non-detected values, so say that for E. coli, you had like, actually not applicable for E. coli, say for TRC, you had like 50 and then 130. Effectively, you're going to assign a value of 0 for all non-detects, report it effectively and average it that way. So for example, if you had oil and grease, the detection limit for oil and grease is generally about 5. If you have a value of 10 and a value of 5, you're going to add 10 plus 0, and then you're going to divide that by 2. So effectively, you're going to have 5 as your average. I know that this is like a very, very brief overview of how this stuff works, and I don't expect you to automatically understand it based off of like 3 minutes of instruction. We actually have an appendix that discusses how to do this and has examples. So if you're not sure how to report a non-detect, look at your appendix. That's going to tell you exactly how to do it, and it provides examples. E. coli is going to be a little bit different because E. coli is just a really fun guy. For E. coli, you must report the data qualifiers signifying less than detection limit for the parameter. So for example, less than 1 per 100 milliliters if the method minimum level is 1 per 100 milliliters. If you're reporting a geometric mean based on a mix of detected and non-detected values, you use 1/2 of the detection limit instead of 0. So that's going to be different. When you're doing a geometric mean, that involves doing some, like effectively doing some square roots and stuff. If you get a 0 underneath the square root, it's going to mess your math up. So that's the reason that you have to use 1/2 the detection limit for that. And it talks about how in the appendix, we have a non-detect example calculation. Number 6, it is a violation of the Missouri Clean Water Law to fail to pay fees. So effectively, every year you have an annual fee due. Just so you guys know, that is not actually affected by the permit renewal. So while the annual fee directly pays for the permit renewal, you don't have to submit that at the same time. And oftentimes, the date that you're required to submit that is going to be different. Additionally, for facilities that are POTWs with a PE of greater than 200, you're probably going to have to do operational monitoring, which is what number 7 is talking about. The permittee shall comply with any applicable requirements in 10 CSR 29, unless you have written notification that we approved a modification of that, which is very uncommon. The monitoring frequencies contained in this permit shall not be construed as modification of monitoring frequencies listed in 10 CSR 29. To request a modification, submit a permit modification application and fee to the department that just requests that. So this table that talks about your operational monitoring is actually going to be in the fact sheet. So if you just look at this special condition, you're like, what do I have to do? I'm not really quite sure. We really don't expect for you guys to look at 10 CSR 29 and decipher what that means. That's our job. And it's often quite a bit difficult, very difficult, I would say, even if you work in this job, to decipher what's going on in those regulations. So that's going to be in the fact sheet. We will very briefly go over the fact sheet in just a moment. If you are a POTW, you likely also have a special condition requiring you to develop and implement a program for maintenance and repair of the collection system. So effectively, this might be smoke testing, or if you have a lot of money, putting a camera down, seeing if you can find any cracks or issues in the facility's collection system. This is particularly important for I&I. So your facility is not going to be able to treat as well if you have a lot of I&I. And it also means generally if you have high I&I, you're not going to be able to meet those percent removal values. So it's a good idea to try to get that I&I under control as soon as possible. This is also required to be submitted to us via EDMR. So January 28th, that's when you're going to have to submit a report to us. That report's going to contain a summary of the efforts to locate and eliminate sources of I&I, a summary of general maintenance and repairs, and any planned maintenance and repairs. Try to include locations if you have them. Obviously, if you don't have a 911 address, which for most of the time you're not going to have a 911 address for every single place that you're maintaining, manual number, GPS location, anything that can help us find where you're talking about.
Jessica.
What's up?
So this is a good time when we do this reconnaissance in our collection system, whether it's manhole observation, the televising, smoke testing. It's a good time to be aware of what's connected to our system and what perhaps might be being discharged into our system. So we should have a sewer use ordinance that protects the owner of the facility against harmful products being entered into our collection system. And so, you know, the operators are the ones that's got to train the administration or educate the administration to the risks involved in what we allow to go on in the collection system. And we need to have that presence to be able to have a little bit of suspicion about some things.
Mm-hmm.
And
You're absolutely
so letting a battleship pull up and dump in our manholes, or a train tanker, or a semi truck, or, you know, some of these septic haulers has got to go somewhere with their products. There may be some collection or treatment systems, mechanical plants that can accommodate that, but there are some that it will be overwhelming for their treatment system to be taking on 1,000 or 2,000 gallons of septic waste, where the BOD is 30,000 parts per million. And to take it a little bit further than that, how about the risk of PFAS, PFAS getting into our collection system? What are we gonna, how about landfills, for crying out loud? How much bigger is a landfill than a battleship? And taking supernatant from landfills, we need to be a little bit suspicious about what the impact to our community will be long range in these instances.
Gary is absolutely right. This CMOM stuff, even though you're required to do it, it really is meant to benefit you guys. And he's absolutely right, particularly for PFAS. It's really, really important to know who is discharging to your facility. And if that is a facility that, you know, may or may not have PFAS. Even domestic facilities without industrial sources may have PFAS. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it is very, very important to know who is discharging to your facility. And sometimes you don't know until you do, you know, some testing like this and determine, maybe like you do dye testing, you determine, oh, there's like somebody's dumping stuff illegally into our collection system. It's a really good time at this time when you're developing your CMOM to be checking for those things, because ultimately that can really affect the health of your treatment facility. Gary is absolutely right, as always. Do we have any other questions before I move on?
Any other questions, Gary?
No, not at this time.
All right, well, please feel free to interrupt me. I know this is a lot of information, folks. So number 9 talks about bypasses. What is a bypass? Bypass can either mean effectively the wastewater went through the treatment facility without being treated, or it went around a portion of treatment. So a bypass could be considered like you're supposed to be using 2 clarifiers and you're not. But it could also mean that you have a huge spill as a result of maybe a pipe breaking, or something catastrophic happens at the treatment facility that results in untreated wastewater going to the ground. If a bypass occurs, you are required to submit this information to us within 24 hours of you noticing. So if, for example, you leave the treatment facility over the weekend and on Monday you come back and you realize, oh crap, it's been bypassing maybe all weekend, I'm not quite sure, you're not in trouble as long as you still report that within 24 hours of you noticing. So if you get to the facility on Monday morning at 8 a.m., you go, oh crap, we're bypassing. As long as you report that by 8 a.m. on Tuesday, you guys are all good. There are a couple of different ways to report this. You can either do it using MoGem, which is the service that we use for EDMR. You would have to have a separate account for SSO bypass. my kind of recommendation is to get this set up before you have a bypass. It's pretty annoying and difficult to get your account set up appropriately when you're worried about, am I going to meet this deadline? I'm worried about the treatment facility. I have a lot to do. It's generally best to get this taken care of before a bypass happens. But just to let you know, we also have an emergency response spill line. So if you have a bypass, you can feel free to call this number and they will put that in the system for you. So say you don't get your SSO bypass stuff set up before you have a bypass, give us a phone call. We only need that within 24 hours. Obviously, we have to figure out what we're going to do to treat, but department staff will give you instructions. Generally, what happens is if you have a bypass where untreated wastewater is going out on the ground, you have to clean up as much of the sludge as possible and then apply lime. That's generally what you do. It's going to be different dependent on your treatment facility and how big the bypass is. Some facilities also use blending, which is where you have partially treated wastewater mixing in with maybe not so treated wastewater. If that's the case for your facility, you have to have that in your facility description. It has to be authorized. You can't just do that. It's not a part of regular operations and maintenance. Number 10, the facility must be sufficiently secured to restrict access by children, livestock, and unauthorized persons. So effectively what this means for most facilities is you have to have a big fence around the facility, a gate, and then a sign that says caution wastewater treatment facility. This is effectively to protect the public. You don't want an unruly teen to get into your treatment facility, fall in and get hurt or something like that. You also want to make sure that you don't have like somebody that's trying to hurt the treatment facility come in and dump something that they shouldn't. Obviously, a slug can really affect your treatment facility and how it functions. So effectively what this means is you got to have fences, you got to have gates. These are required by 10 CSR 28. In other permits, you might actually have special conditions that specify you must have a gate, you must have a fence. For this particular permit, we aren't required to do that. And that's how most permits are going to look in the future. Number 11, you have to have an O&M manual. It has to be maintained by the permittee and made available to the operator. It shall include key operating procedures and a brief summary of the operation of the facility. Obviously, you guys are absolutely experts. A lot of you have been working at your treatment facilities for a very long time, maybe even longer than I've been alive. So you might automatically know how to operate and maintain the facility. You've been there, very long time. But it's important to have this documentation for several reasons. One, something could happen to you, unfortunately, whether that is you get sick and you can't go to the facility for the day, or you might retire eventually, God willing. If that's the case, you're going to want your replacement to understand how to maintain the facility. You don't want all of your hard work in maintaining the facility to, effectively go out the window when you leave. So every facility is required to have an O&M manual. And when you get inspected, they will ask you for your O&M manual. It doesn't have to be anything, extreme or anything. It just has to effectively encapsulate everything that's going on at the facility. Additionally, an all-weather access road shall be maintained. For most facilities, this isn't, a problem. If you have a lagoon, you might have to put some gravel down or something. But effectively, you need a way for a honey wagon to come down and get sludge out, or, for people to actually access the treatment facility. If an inspector has to trudge through several miles of jungle to get to your treatment facility, they're probably not going to be very happy with you. Number 13, the outfall sewer shall be protected and maintained against the effects of floodwater, ice, and other hazards to reasonably ensure its structural stability, freedom from stoppage, and that a clean sample of the effluent can be obtained before it mixes with receiving waters. So if you have a bunch of grass growing in your outfall, that's going to affect your values possibly for TSS. You could have soil in your sample. So even if your treatment facility is running at the best it can run, you're shooting yourself in the foot because your outfall is going to have a bunch of gunk in it. Now, this is also really important for facilities that do phosphorus removal. A lot of the time, those aluminum salts or iron salts will kind of get stuck in the outfall. So you could have artificially high values for those parameters, even if you're doing everything you should be doing for your facility. So these few special conditions here are going to be specific to the facility. So obviously, if you have a lagoon, you're going to have the one for lagoons. If you have, a sand filter, you're going to have the one for sand filters. Not every facility is going to have all these. So if you have a lagoon, you're probably not going to have both number 14 and number 16. Number 14 talks about how the lagoon shall be operated and maintained to ensure their structural integrity. So that means no deep-rooted vegetation. You can't have a huge forest next to your lagoon. Animal dens. This one can actually be a little bit fun. If you can get permission of your city administrator to maybe do a little bit of hunting next to your facility, especially if you have muskrats or some big turtles in there, it can actually be a little bit of a fun time. But you got to make sure that there aren't muskrat dens or anything that's going to cause, possibly a cave-in or something like that. Muskrats can be kind of difficult to manage. I have seen inspection reports where the previous inspection said, hey, you got to clear out these animal dens. The operator says, yep, we took care of it, they're dead. And then the inspector comes by and they see a muskrat in the lagoon. Obviously, it can be kind of difficult to do this stuff. Good idea to talk to your city administrator to see how they want to handle that. Number 15, the facility shall ensure that adequate provisions are provided to prevent or minimize surface water intrusion and to divert stormwater runoff. So basically, you don't want your embankments to erode. You don't want to have, big hole where your embankment was supposed to be. Structural integrity of your lagoon should maintain the same. If you have a sand filter, the media in your filter beds shall be properly maintained to prevent surface pooling, vegetative growth, and accumulation of leaf litter. I've had some operators on some private facilities say, oh, well, the person that installed it said that the vegetative growth actually helps clean the wastewater more. And that's not the case. When you have pooling and you have vegetative growth in these types of facilities, they can't filter as effectively. Sometimes you actually have to replace that media in the filter bed if it's been a long time. So obviously make sure that you're up on your maintenance on that. And if you see some pooling, it might be a good idea to redistribute some of the media. Number 17 is going to talk about wet test conditions. For the most part, you guys are not going to really have to look at this. This is something that your lab is going to look at and say, okay, here's how we conduct the test. If you are doing wet tests in-house, then obviously this is going to be a lot more important for you. The most important part here is going to be this dilution series. So if you have mixing, this dilution series is going to be different. And that's because if you have mixing, then you're not going to have like 150, 25, 12.5 in the stream. In the stream, you're going to have maybe 8, maybe 36. Generally, that's going to be based off of calculations, based off of how much mixing that you get. For facilities without mixing, you're going to have 150, 25, 12.5, and 6.25. If you have monitoring only, then your wet test special condition will stop here. But if you actually have a limit, it's going to talk about what happens if you go over that limit. If you exceed your limit, you have to do a follow-up wet test. You have to report that in the same sort of units. And the additional toxicity testing is going to be like, you might actually have to take several tests. So you're going to have to take a multiple dilution test within 60 days of becoming aware that the regularly scheduled wet test exceeded a limit. And once every 2 weeks until you meet one of these conditions. Either 3 consecutive multiple dilution tests are below the limit, or a total of 3 multiple dilution tests exceed the limit. So either you got to have 3 tests where everything's all good, or 3 tests where everything is not all good. Some of these have to be consecutive. So if you're using the multiple dilution test where you're meeting the limit, you're going to have to do 3 in a row. This is why generally you want to be meeting those wet test limits because this is pretty expensive. It gets expensive quite quickly. Number 2 says follow-up tests do not negate an initial test result. So you can't just say, oh, well, I took 1 test after this positive result, so I don't have to do this stuff. Not the case. You're probably going to have to do those 3 extra tests still. And submit a summary of all the wet test results with copies of lab reports within 14 days of the availability. Number 18 is only going to be for facilities that have greater than 100,000 gallons per day. And it's only going to apply to these facilities because you're only required to do this expanded effluent testing in B2, which is the form that you're going to have to submit. This data shall be provided with the permit renewal application, and it talks about how to take these samples here. So samples must be taken a minimum of 3 samples within 4 1/2 years prior to the date of the permit application. What does that mean? Does it mean that you have to take 4 samples outside of DMR testing? And the answer is no. If you have DMR results for all these parameters, you can just reuse those results. So say that you've submitted, like 4 quarters of data, just reuse those 4 quarters of data in the Form B2. You're not going to have to retake these samples. Talks about how approved and sufficiently sensitive methods should be used, and generally talks about what to do with ML or if you have a non-detect. We're not going to get too far into that because this is something that you're only going to have to do once every 5 years. And this is the last part of the permit. This says you have a right to appeal. If you are adversely affected by this decision, or if your permit writer did not go through the necessary steps, you can appeal the permit. So if the permit writer didn't put the permit on public notice for 30 days, you can appeal the permit. You must file an appeal within 30 days. So if 31 days passes, the appeal date, it's already over. We do need to make sure that that is sent by registered mail as well. And this is the address that you need to be submitting that to. Interestingly, even though this document is 30 pages long, that's the end of your permit. So let's talk about really briefly what the difference is between a permit and a fact sheet. Permit is enforceable. Every single part of the permit is enforceable, including little notes, including anything that your permit writer might add about the facility description. All of that is enforceable. However, the fact sheet is not enforceable. So stuff that you see in the fact sheet, if, for example, something in the fact sheet doesn't match up with what's in the permit, what's in the permit's going to trump that. And what is a fact sheet? I'll tell you. A fact sheet effectively provides, shows you what work the permit writer did to establish your effluent limitations. So this says, here's the equation that we used to determine your ammonia effluent limits. Or here's the regulation that we looked at to determine what your sample type was going to be. The fact sheet, while not enforceable, can still be quite important. So we won't go through all 20 pages of the fact sheet, but I will point out some really important parts of the fact sheet that you might want to look at, even if you've already read the permit. So one of the most important parts of your fact sheet is actually going to be on this first page, and it's going to be the comments. These comments tell you what changed. So if you don't want to, print out your old permit and your new permit and side by side go through with a highlighter, which most people probably don't want to do, everything that's changed in your permit should be in this comment section. So for this facility, changes in this permit for outfall 1 included the addition of a schedule of compliance for ammonia and the addition of influent monitoring for nutrients. So that's the difference between your new permit and your old permit. This talks about the receiving stream, just what stream you're discharging to. And this information talks about mixing calculations. Most of this stuff is not going to be important other than changes to effluent limitations table. This is a visual representation of what changed in your permit. So for this permit, we just changed the ammonia values. It's very common, and in fact, almost all permits will now have 4 seasons worth of effluent values. If you would prefer that you only have 2, that's fine, but we will choose the most stringent of effectively the season. So if you decided I only want 1 ammonia, like I only want to worry about 1 set of parameters, we would choose 12.1 and 1.5 to be your parameters. We have to choose the one that's most stringent. Down here, it briefly discusses how we got to the limits. So this says, here's the regulation that states how we got to the limits. Again, we don't really anticipate that you guys are going to be reading these regulations. It's pretty difficult, and that's our job. So this stuff talks about what parameters you have, how we did those. We also have a table about changes to influent monitoring here. It's going to tell you what new changes we had to influent monitoring. And the rest of this stuff just talks about stuff about your facility. So this says, hey, what did we change? What's the continuing authority? Most of this stuff is stuff that you're not going to be looking at. Most important portions of the fact sheet are going to be operator certification requirements and operational control testing. So this operational certification requirements, if you're required to have an operator, you should see your name here. And it should say your certification number and certification level. If you already meet the requirement of certification level, there's nothing else you have to do. If you don't, we're going to provide you 6 months to get that figured out. So if you need to upgrade from a D to a C, we will help you do that. And that will be in your permit. Also very important is this operational control testing. So remember how we had a special condition that talked about 10 CSR 29? That's what this is. This is telling you what operational monitoring you are required to do. This table will be very important because if an inspector comes to visit you, they're going to want to know that you're doing this operational monitoring. So you're going to want to make sure that every single day you're taking a flow value for influent or effluent. If you see something in here that you don't have, like for example, if you don't have chlorine and it says that you're required to do operational monitoring for chlorine, make sure you let us know because these are requirements. Very important there. The rest of the stuff is not particularly important for you guys. It's good to look at this stuff. It tells you how we determined what your effluent limitations are, but it doesn't necessarily tell you things that you have to be doing. The most important part of the fact sheet is going to be at the very bottom. This is going to tell you who wrote your permit. This is going to tell you how to contact them. So if you have questions, something doesn't look right, even if it's several years outside of your renewal, you can call this number. Now, I will say we have quite a bit of turnover in the operating permit section. If you call this number and somebody's not available, you can still contact us at cleanwaterpermits@dnr.mo.gov. We're always happy to help you decipher what's going on with your permit. But this is going to be really the most important section here. We also have some appendices. So one thing that might be important for you guys to look at in the appendices is the classification worksheet. This explains how we determine the operational certification level. So say, for example, your permit writer has marked that you have screening, and that gave you 3 points. If you don't have screening, you should let us know because you might get a lower operational certification level. Also very important, on your application, we ask you what lab work is done inside the plant. Every single person should at least be marking that they are doing push button or visual methods for simple tests such as pH or settable solids. That's because those are instant tests. So you can't take a sample and drive it to the lab 3 hours later and get a pH. It's an instant test. You have to take it right there. So for most facilities, you're going to have a 3 there. We also have the non-detect example calculations. So I know we went over this very briefly, but this explains, what if I have a non-detect? What if I have a mix of different samples? It explains exactly how to do it. And that is the end of the permit. What questions do we have about permits?
Gary.
Yes, I'm right here. If anybody out there has questions about your permit, specific questions about your permit, right now is a good time to discuss those. So we talked about a lot of things in the last hour and a half. One of the things I noticed in permits is comments section or history, system performance history. And that's a good way to read up on maybe what's been going on over the last permit cycle, maybe even beyond that. So if you're new to the position, and in some of our permits, there is a fast link to seeing what the performance has been historically. And that has a little bit of effect on maybe your permit or how often inspectors come by, things like that. Your compliance history, it's all important. Any questions out there in the water world?
Yeah, we have a question. Shouldn't Chapter 9 rules and regs be put in the permit?
No. So a lot of the times we incorporate things by reference. Chapter 9 is pretty long. It would be pretty difficult for us to incorporate entirely. It would probably be a good idea for us to incorporate operational monitoring, put that table in the permit. But because we're trying to reduce the amount of space that's in the permit, it's incorporated by reference.
So, Jessica, are you gonna talk a little bit about general permits?
Not today. Today, we're going to talk about site specifics primarily. General permits effectively are the same permit for each person. So if you have specific questions about your general permit, it's really difficult to go through every single general permit or even all of the considerations of a general permit, because you might have like 10 tables and not all of them are going to be applicable to every facility. If you have questions about general permits, it's probably best for you to discuss with your permit writer. The other thing is that general permits are actually not considered NPDES permits. So a lot of the time they're no discharge. NPDES stands for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So if you have a no discharge permit, it's actually not a NPDES permit.
Any questions? We're waiting on the response from our attendees. Just type it in the chat room there. I'll see if I can pick it up.
Any other questions going once?
Maybe
Any
there's
other questions going twice?
perhaps it's a good time for a 10-minute break.
Fantastic.
All right, we will take a 10-minute break and we will discuss what permit language you might have in your permit regarding PFAS.
Okay, the time right now is 9:34. If everybody could meet back here at 9:45, we're going to give you 11 minutes. Real quick before you take a break, don't forget this is a free class. Thank you for attending with us today. If I could have everyone that's within the sound of my voice put your name, your certification number in the chat box, along with your system name and your job title. I know I'm asking a whole bunch, but hey, you're getting 4 hours for drinking water treatment, 2 hours for distribution, and 4 hours for wastewater. If you could do that for us, we would certainly appreciate it. Take a 10-minute break. Okay, we're back. It's 9:46, sorry. I went a minute over. I'm sure that's horrible. If I got another request, if you are in a watch party means there's more than one person sitting at a device looking at it. I see you guys as water plant. If you could please put your names and your cert numbers in the chat box. That way we know 100% who we can give credit for being with us today. I think we're going to go ahead and get started again. I'm going to share the screen and then I'm going to be passing the mouse back over to Jess. Give us 2 seconds here.
All righty, folks, we're going to get started talking about PFAS just a little bit. We're going to do this
Jessica, before you get started, I had a few observations about the NPDES permit in my travel across Missouri. One of the things I spent a lot of time on in communities is going through the permit with the operators. And for the most part, the operators have got a good feel for what's in the permit, but understand that a lot of operations staff that we work with has got less than 2 years experience. Some of them a whole lot less than that. So in a lot of cases, we're trying to get the operations staff up to speed on what's in the permit, what they're required to do. The goal is compliance. And then it always involves looking at the treatment facility and collection system and trying to diagnose problems within that to help meet compliance as well. A huge part of the compliance issues with relative to their permit is reporting not getting the reports in. I don't know whether for what reason, various reasons. Some of it just gets blowed off. Some of it from not understanding the permit. Some of it may be from not understanding EDMR system or having problems. But so we spend a lot of time in the field working with staff on the understanding their permits. So, and then we take it to the next level when we have the opportunity is working with the board. And so when there's challenges come to the board on compliance, normally in those cases, their compliance history is littered with issues. And so we're trying to rectify all that, get them running the bases in the straight line, so to speak, and achieving compliance. And one of the things that I realized is they think they understand the permit. And in one case, at a board meeting, I asked that question after about an hour of dialogue, trying to figure out what we need to do with their lagoon and how we're gonna achieve compliance, or whether we need to think about regionalization. And I asked them, do y'all think you got a good feel for what's in the permit? You understand the permit? And they all thought they had a pretty good feel for the permit. So then I asked, how many of you read the permit? And none of them have read the permit. And so they're relying on the operator. They're relying on somebody. Relying on me to make this all happen. The burden is on the owner. The burden is on the board. The operations staff is supposed to make this work. But I think one of the things that we need to be more vocal about out in the field is, this boards, the burden is on them to make this all work and be compliant.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's unfortunate because operators, you are doing probably 20 critical jobs for the whole city. You guys have the most to do out of anybody, and you are the most essential. And I think just because the boards are used to relying on you so much, they expect you to know what's going on. But Gary is absolutely right. The person whose name's on the permit is the person who's required to meet all these conditions. So it might be best whenever you get your permit to try to either have a meeting with city council, or if you're too busy, set city council up with your permit writer. We will explain all of the conditions in the permit because ultimately they are the people that are responsible for maintaining compliance. It's going to be really, really hard to maintain compliance if you haven't read the permit. And I know that it looks like a lot of words and stuff, but that's why it's important to differentiate between the permit and the fact sheet. So typically your permit's only going to be anywhere from 5 to like 12 pages long. If you can, it's really a good idea to print that stuff out, mark it up with, whatever system works for you, whether you want to highlight stuff or get different colored pens. It's always a good idea to go through the permit line by line, especially with your city administrators. Again, if you guys are having trouble talking to the city administrators, I know sometimes you can say, hey, we're having this compliance issue. We either need to install, maybe we need to install more blowers, or we need money for something, and they're not listening to you. You can ask the department to step in. We are willing to talk to whoever, because they need to understand that you're not asking for things that are unreasonable. You're just trying to do your job.
Thank you. I'll keep quiet now. You can start talking about your next subject.
Well, Gary, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. Gary, I'm sure as all of you guys know as operators, Gary is like a huge resource, even for the department. So I'm always happy to answer any questions, especially if they're coming from Gary. We are going to briefly discuss NPDES language for PFAS. It's going to be a little bit in kind of a wrong order. We're going to talk about PFAS after we talk about this language, but that's just kind of the structure that we have today. So PFAS is generally standing for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. This is a group of over 10,000 chemicals. We're going to briefly discuss some proposed language that we developed through our PFAS work group. So our PFAS work group is a bunch of stakeholders who are experts. This could be people that work in labs, could be large POTWs. Effectively, it's a group of stakeholders that are developing policy recommendations for the department that will then be implemented at the end of the year. If you are interested in joining this work group, because you have something to say, because I honestly believe that smaller POTWs are not as well represented in these work groups as they should be, please contact me. We will get you set up. I know that you guys are very busy, so if you just need like information about what's going on with those work groups, we're going to have report outs in May and August at the Water Protection Forums. So we're going to very briefly discuss NPDES special condition language for direct dischargers, which is going to be your industries. So this is going to be facilities that are directly discharging metal finishing facilities, landfills. And we're only very briefly going to talk about this because this probably is not going to apply for most of you guys. Generally, what we're looking at is probably going to be BMPs or best management practices for source reduction. We don't think that we have the regulatory authority right now to require sampling. I do anticipate within the next 5 to 10 years, we might have a limit for PFAS, but that's a little bit further down the road. What we're working on right now is going to be these BMPs. So for direct dischargers, within 6 months or however long they tell us they need, they have to provide an evaluation of whether the facility uses or has historically used any products described in EPA Draft Method 1633, which is the primary method for wastewater analysis. Also, they have to tell us whether those products can reasonably be reduced or eliminated. So a lot of the times you're going to see this for AFFF or aqueous film forming foam. This is effectively used as firefighting foam for hydrocarbon fuels. So you're going to see this a lot in airplane hangars, military bases. Afterwards, they're going to have to develop an annual status report that includes all that information and submit it to us. It's going to be submitted as an uncertified attachment, and the reason for that is the method is still in draft form, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This is for direct dischargers, so this is probably not going to apply to POTWs. We do have language specific to POTWs we will discuss right now. We'll see if I can, is it up on the screen?
It's over here.
Oh, here you go.
See it?
No.
2 seconds.
I got a lot of material, so keeping Andy on his toes.
Is it? Oh, no.
Nope, that's the direct dischargers. We're looking for POTWs. Should be the second document. That's direct dischargers again. There we go. That's perfect. Right. Here we go. Oh, no worries at all. I came in with about 5 different things for Andy to get ready. So he is we're getting his money worth out of him today. So this special condition is going to be for POTWs with pretreatment programs. You might be saying, Jess, we don't have a pretreatment program, but we might have PFAS in our system. That's going to be something that we're going to have to develop some more information on within the next year. Unfortunately, I don't have anything to provide you right now. But for POTWs that already do have pretreatment programs, this might be something that you see in your permit in the next few years. This is effectively very similar to the language that we saw before. It just is a lot more specific to POTWs. So we'll read through this entirely. Within 6 months of the effective date of this permit, or however long that you guys need, that can be changed depending on your needs, the facility shall provide the department for its review an initial evaluation of likely non-domestic sources of significant PFAS loadings into the sewer system, as well as the POTW's proposed approach to work with those sources to identify and implement minimization strategies. So specifically non-domestic sources. We do specify that because there are domestic sources of PFAS. So right here, what we're looking for is, do you have a landfill that discharges to you? Do you have possibly a FFF discharge? Do you have a pulp and paperboard manufacturer? Do you have a metal finishing facility? Both targeted and non-targeted PFAS sampling should be considered as appropriate. Again, what does that mean? Targeted sampling says you're going to get a result for specific concentrations for specific PFAS. So, for example, two of the most commonly used PFAS are PFOA and PFOS. If you use draft method 1633, it's going to tell you you have this many parts per trillion of PFOA. Non-targeted analysis is going to be through draft method 1621. What that means is that it's more of a screening. So it more says you do have presence or you have absence. You are not required to submit the results to us. So this is just something that you're doing for yourself. You're actually not even required to do this testing. However, it's highly encouraged. And the reason for that is, even if you have a good idea of what industries discharge to you, sometimes they'll tell you, I don't have any PFAS discharge. And that might not be the case. These are used so ubiquitously, so widespread, that it's possible that a facility is using these and is not aware. So we've seen this kind of across the country in places that have started to implement this sort of sampling. So that a facility will say, you know, I'm not discharging anything to the POTW, we should be good to go. POTW samples and they go, oh crap, we got a huge hit of PFAS. So that's where it's going to be important for you guys to take those samples. Unless the POTW is aware of information to the contrary, the evaluation should prioritize significant industrial users, followed by industrial users, and finally, other non-domestic sources of potential concern. So that's absolutely going to be dependent on what's going on for your facility. Then you're going to have to submit the results. So an annual status report shall be submitted, which includes the latest list of potential PFAS sources and summary of actions taken to, 1, characterize loadings from priority potential sources, and efforts to reduce or eliminate PFAS loading from these sources, as well as adjustments in approach based on the findings. So you might be saying, you know, I'm not sure what to do. Maybe we just don't let this facility discharge anymore. That has its pros and cons, right? So if that facility is not discharging to your POTW, they have to make their own treatment facility. That means that you're going to have less PFAS in your, in your facility, but that might mean that you're driving the industry out of town, which can be a problem because a lot of the time these industries are providing a lot of employment opportunities for people in town, particularly in small towns. You can also talk to these facilities about possibly eliminating or otherwise substituting for other less fluorinated objects. So, for example, for AFFF, the DoD or the Department of Defense is currently working on establishing non-fluorinated aqueous film forming foams. So it doesn't have PFAS in it. Right now, we're honestly in the very much so early stages of product elimination and substitution. Sometimes there's not a whole lot that you can do. But you need to be making sure that you understand these sources because eventually there will be limits. A says that both targeted and non-targeted sampling is appropriate. PFAS data, which is derived from unapproved methods and shared with DNR, shall be submitted to DNR via an uncertified attachment. So what that means is that these methods are in draft form. They are not approved yet. They're not in 40 CFR 136, which means that you cannot certify that it is true and accurate to the best of your ability. We're not quite sure yet. Generally, I don't anticipate that we will establish this condition in permits until after those have been approved. So we're not asking you to use unapproved, possibly proprietary methods to determine this stuff. We're going to wait until EPA has moved a little bit more. Number 3 says submit the annual report and any related findings via the EDMR system as an attachment. And within 60 days of the permit effective date, the permittee shall also update its process for evaluating new and/or expanded industrial users and any other potential sources of concern to the POTW to include an evaluation of PFAS loadings. Such evaluation shall include PFAS data from similar facilities under common ownership as the proposed new/expanded industrial user, as well as representative PFAS sampling of the new/expanded users' waste streams as soon as representative samples are available. So you might have to change your approach to this. It's very important to note that this is draft language. So this is not finalized language. You're not going to see this in your permit tomorrow. This can still go through several rounds of effectively review. What it also means is if you think that something that you see on the screen here does not make sense for POTWs, whether that's your facility particularly, or if you think that there's a glaring issue that'll affect several POTWs, let us know. If you have comments on this language, we want to hear it. This is trying to develop policy recommendations for the department, which means that we are still open to stakeholder input. If you see something on here that's confusing, doesn't make sense, or appears to not be applicable to POTWs, let us know. Please feel free to contact me and we will get that edit in there. This is the language that we might be seeing starting next year. However, I do want to make it very clear the timeline for PFAS in wastewater. We do have draft aquatic life criteria from EPA, but what happens is they're going to develop that draft aquatic life criteria, and then every 3 years we determine how we want to change our water quality standards. We have several other issues that are a little bit more pressing than PFAS, so primarily that's going to be nutrients. So that means that it still might be 10 or so years before you see a limit in your permit. However, as we're going to discuss during our PFAS presentation, you're going to want to start thinking of this stuff now. You're going to want to make sure that you have funding sources available because this is a very expensive and very widespread problem. Now we are going to transition to PowerPoint.
Can you see it on this?
Mhm. All right, so today, this is going to be my favorite topic. I'm very excited to present this to you guys. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances in wastewater, or PFAS. Next slide, please. So this is going to be a whole bunch of chemistry stuff. If you get lost, let me know. But effectively, PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Usually in organic chemistry, it's super common to have carbon backbones surrounded by hydrogens. It's just a pretty solid and very stable bond. However, PFAS are man-made. So what they have is carbon-fluorine bonds. Very interesting facts about fluorine. It's the most electronegative atom on the periodic table of elements. What does that mean? It means that fluorine really, really wants one more electron to be stable. And when it gets that electron, that bond is extremely stable, does not want to break apart, and generally won't. That's one of the reasons that PFAS are such big issues, is because of that really, really strong bond. It doesn't degrade in the environment at all. So if you have this stuff going to your treatment facility, it's passing right through and possibly even getting concentrated. How we determine what different PFAS are is going to be based on something called the terminal group, or basically just the N group. Two of the most common PFAS compounds that you're going to have are PFOA and PFOS. So PFOA has a carboxylic group and PFOS has a sulfonic acid group. It's really important that because the classification of these is so broad, it really only contains chains of carbon and fluorine atoms. There are over 10,000 of these. So these are very widespread, very common to be used in a lot of different manufacturing processes. Next slide, please. So where does this stuff come from? Where are you generally going to be seeing hits from? Generally, the main industries you're going to be seeing hits from are pulp and paper mills, nonstick and stain resistant products. So this is a really general group. It can include stuff like your clothing, the carpeting, could be stuff like on the table. It could even be Sharpies. Sharpies are actually water resistant because of PFAS. We're also going to see this in AFFF, which we discussed a little bit prior, which is aqueous film forming foam. This is used very widespread in airport bases and military bases. So if you have a military base next to your treatment facility, you might be a little bit concerned about this stuff. You're also going to see this in metal finishing facilities, particularly if you have chromium electroplating facilities. Unfortunately, chromium is a carcinogen. So what happens during that metal finishing process is that they use PFAS as a surfactant to reduce the amount of chromium that people are inhaling. Unfortunately, PFAS is a carcinogen. So they've sort of replaced one carcinogen with another carcinogen. And specifically for chromium electroplating facilities, you're going to have huge hits of PFAS. We'll skip past landfills just for a moment to talk about paints and varnishes. So this is just anything, any paint or varnish. The walls in your house right now have PFAS in them. Leather tanning, again, used as a surfactant in leather tanning. This means that a lot of your clothing, whether it's leather or not, is going to contain PFAS. It's used to make things waterproof, oil resistant, and fire resistant as well. You're also going to see this in chemical manufacturing. So these are man-made chemicals. We have to produce them somehow. Oftentimes, what you have is that PFAS are used in other PFAS production. So for example, one example of this would be like Teflon. Teflon is often used in cookware, and Teflon itself, we're pretty sure, is not toxic. But they use PFOA to make Teflon, which means that they're discharging PFOA as they're making this non-toxic version of PFAS. Finally, landfills. So while landfills are not directly creating PFAS, they're not producing it in any sense, anything that ends up in a landfill is probably going to have PFAS. Everything that has PFAS that ends in a landfill is going to end up having a discharge. Landfills have leachate, so either they're directly discharging that, which is very, very uncommon to possibly not existent in Missouri because landfill leachate is so high strength. A lot of the time, what they're going to be doing is discharging this stuff to your treatment facility, and that's where you're going to have problems. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the PFAS cycle in action, why this matters and how it affects you guys. From the previous slide, it seems like, oh, this is just a manufacturing problem. This is not going to affect me. Unfortunately, it is going to affect you. So generally what we have going on the left-hand side is that we have some sort of manufacturing facility. They're either going to directly discharge to a stream, or because they have things called effluent limitation guidelines or additional regulations that they have to meet if they're directly discharging that stuff, they're going to say, we don't really want to do that, and they're going to discharge to you guys. That's why it's so important for you to get a complete understanding of what facilities are discharging to you. Because if one of these facilities, a landfill, or if you have a metal finishing facility that's discharging to you, you're going to have a huge amount of PFAS in your system. What also happens is that because there isn't treatment that can really effectively do PFAS in general wastewater treatment facilities, generally what's going to happen is that that PFAS is either going to directly get discharged to the receiving stream, or it may actually become concentrated in biosolids, particularly for longer chain PFAS, like PFOS. When we say longer chain, what we mean is the chemical is physically longer. So you might have 4 or 5 carbons connected to a whole bunch of fluorines, or you could have like 8 to 10 carbons connected to a bunch of fluorines. Those longer chain PFAS, we have more information about. So we know about their toxicity a little bit better. What has happened in the manufacturing circles is that people are saying, oh, these long chain PFAS are bad. We're going to choose to use what are probably better PFAS, short chain PFAS. What we're determining is that these short chain PFAS don't necessarily break down in the environment any quicker. And in fact, you're creating a huger problem because you're using chemicals that we have less information about and might not even have a name for. What happens also is that when this stuff gets concentrated in biosolids, that's either land applied to a farmer's field or you send it to the landfill. The landfill's already going to have a whole lot of PFAS, and they might discharge their leachate to you guys, which creates a cycle, right? You're sending PFAS-laden biosolids to the landfill, and the landfill's sending PFAS-laden leachate to you guys. This is a really important cycle because eventually all this stuff ends up in the environment, right? So when we're treating wastewater, when we're trying to make sure that all the ammonia and all that good stuff is taken care of, eventually the final resting place for this stuff is the environment. So what happens is that the stuff gets discharged into rivers and streams, and there might be a drinking water intake on the same stream that you have a discharge of PFAS. That's generally how it's going to be getting into our drinking water treatment facilities, is discharges from manufacturing facilities or wastewater treatment facilities. I know that a lot of people are concerned about biosolids use. We will discuss that a little bit later in this presentation. Next slide, please. So what are the domestic sources of wastewater or for PFAS? Michigan is a state that's quite a bit ahead of other states in terms of their research. They found minimal PFAS in domestic waste with no industrial inputs. Typically, the background concentration is going to be 2 to 7 parts per trillion. Other studies have shown similar results, although that is also variable. I just read a study last week.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
I don't know if this pertains to any of this, but has there been any studies on aquatic life in rivers and streams throughout the state that, like say fish, for example, are loaded with PFAS?
Yeah, that's a great question. So MDC is currently doing fish tissue sampling at about like 6 locations across the state. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in the future, but primarily our understanding of how this stuff bioaccumulates at the trophic level is going to be from other states. Other states, they're just a lot ahead in terms of research. They have a lot more funding and they have a lot more concern with this stuff. We will discuss that a little bit more in a minute, but if you have specific questions, let me know so that when we get to that, we can kind of address those. Any questions before we move on? All right.
Nothing fielded here.
All right, we will move forward. If you have a specific question about that research, we're going to talk about it more toward the end of these slides. If you have specific questions, let me know. I'm happy to answer them. I will have sort of a caveat on this slide. Just a couple weeks ago, I read a study that said that PFAS is in toilet paper, which makes sense because pulp and paper manufacturing is a huge source of PFAS. That means that no matter what you do, if you get rid of all the industrial sources to your POTW, you're still going to have this stuff in your treatment facility. No one is going to be exempt from this stuff, which is why it's so important for us to look at this stuff now as opposed to later. You don't want to be caught, in a bad situation when limits finally come down, you don't have a treatment for them. We anticipate a lot of concern about liability, which is something that we're going to discuss a little bit later. But it's probably good to get ahead of that stuff so you don't get sued later on, as opposed to waiting until the last minute. Generally, with domestic facilities, you're going to have huge spikes of PFAS when you have a surprise industrial user, which is why it's really, really important to make sure that you understand who is discharging to you, where your sources of PFAS may be. Sometimes what happens is that you don't have any industrial users, but you have huge hits of PFAS. First of all, that could be from legacy contamination from military bases possibly, but there could be somebody that's discharging to your system that you're not aware of. So that's where it's really, really important to make sure you understand what's going on with your system and who's discharging. Next slide, please. So I know that you guys are probably quite familiar with this, but we're going to just kind of briefly discuss what the fate of industrial wastewater is in Missouri. So facilities can either have a direct discharge. So if this is the manufacturing facility, they have their own treatment facility. They're not discharging to you guys, directly discharging to the environment. They are required to have a permit with us to do this. As you guys probably know, for any of these sorts of activities, you have to have a permit. So we're really hoping that the facilities that are already kind of separated from the POTWs might be the ones that have the most PFAS discharge. Primarily, that's going to be your categorical industries. So a lot of the times you're going to have a really dirty manufacturing facility that the POTW said, we don't really want to take that waste. That's where you're going to see these direct dischargers. Sometimes they have more sophisticated treatment than you guys have because they have a lot more money than you guys have. So they're generally funded, through their profits, whereas you guys have taxpayer money that you have to, rate increases, perhaps holding a bond election. It's a lot easier for them to have more sophisticated instrumentation. In the case of indirect discharge, this is where you guys are going to come in. So this might be a situation where a manufacturing facility has said, we don't want to deal with this wastewater. It's going to be too hard for us to treat. So they discharge to you guys. This is where you guys are going to come in the most. This is where you're going to see those huge hits of PFAS. You are required to have a permit for this. And if the discharger is categorical, you'll also need a pre-treatment program. There may be some circumstances where you have a manufacturing industry discharging to you, but you don't have a pre-treatment program. In those circumstances, we are recommending that you possibly create a pretreatment program. It's going to be a lot easier to deal with this stuff and effectively limit the sources that you're going to have to your treatment facility if you have a pretreatment program. The last sort of industrial wastewater fate is going to be land application. Some of you might already be doing this. So you might not have a discharging facility, you might have an irrigation system, or you might be land applying biosolids. This is really an unsure method. Right now, I know that a lot of people have questions. How are biosolids going to be handled given that PFAS is going to become a CERCLA hazardous substance? I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately. Effectively, that regulation that we have right now talks about how 1 pound per 24 hours is the reportable quantity. But when you're land applying, you're not land applying that much PFAS all at once, right? It's a regular occurrence of you land applying. You're probably not going to have 1 pound in 24 hours, but you might have several pounds over several years. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you on how this is going to be handled. We need some more information on EPA. Next slide, please. So Michigan, again, really ahead of a lot of other states. Sometimes that comes to bite them in the butt, but sometimes it's quite helpful. So we can look at the data that they have in Michigan to kind of determine how the spread's going to be. So this was a study that they did in Michigan to evaluate industrial contributors of PFAS to wastewater treatment facilities. Even in known contributors, even when you know I have a landfill that's discharging to me, PFAS concentrations are going to be extremely variable, and it's really going to depend on the facility. This is why it's so important to get full disclosure from industries that are discharging to you. Really, really important. If you look at this graph, it talks about the percentage of facilities that had detections. So this is just talking about who had it and who didn't. In landfills, 100% of municipal active landfills have this stuff, 100%. The value is 88% because there are some demolition and construction landfills who have basically lower values or no values. There is really a significant presence versus absence for this stuff, which is why 1621 might be a good option if you're not sure. The facilities that are marked with 2 asterisks in the map had the highest concentrations. So even though chemical manufacturers only made up 24% of PFAS detections, they had the highest concentrations because honestly, we know very little about how PFAS are used in chemical manufacturing. They're used in a wide variety of processes that may be difficult to nail down. This is why it is so, so important. Get full disclosure if you can. Try to make sure you understand what's coming into your system. It's really going to help you out a lot. Next slide, please. So landfills are one of the biggest issues that we're going to have. They don't generate PFAS, but they receive them from any source. Something that I like to say to people that may be a bit scary is if you look at the room around you right now, probably every single item in the room has PFAS in it. So whether you're looking at the table, your water bottle, your clothing, the paint, the carpeting, something that my boss likes to say is close your eyes. Everything you see has PFAS, including you. So even if you close your eyes and you're not looking at anything in the room, humans, 98% of humans have PFAS in their blood, based on a study that CDC did in 2000, starting in 2000. So this stuff is everywhere, and landfills are going to receive all of that stuff. When you throw away carpeting, when you throw away your clothing, when you throw away food wrappers, all that stuff's going to end up in the landfill. And for some reason, probably because landfills are an interesting and sort of a new environment, PFAS moves in ways that we don't fully understand. So they may become mobile due to breakdown of biosolids. There's also a concern with PFAS reacting with landfill liners to produce byproducts, which means that effectively you're putting this stuff in a landfill, and in the landfill is a big question mark, what's happening with this PFAS? Some of it may be sequestered in the landfill, which is good. It means that it's not going to the environment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the environment is completely safe, particularly given the breakdown of this stuff and the way that we generally put landfill leachate into POTWs, right? You're receiving this very high strength waste that's tend to have like quite a bit of PFAS in it. So that means that you guys are going to be dealing with this issue the most. If you have a landfill that discharges to you, I highly, highly recommend that you get on top of this stuff as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So biosolids are obviously a product of the wastewater treatment process. So if you guys have a POTW, you guys have a treatment facility, you're going to have biosolids. And you're required to treat these according to 40 CFR 503. That's a self-implementing regulation, which we very briefly discussed in the NPDES permit presentation. What it means is that even if you don't have a permit, you are still required to meet these levels of removal for rodents and other things. The current program in Missouri is federal. We don't have additional state regulations. So vector and pathogen control, all that stuff is going to be done by 40 CFR 503. We don't have any Missouri specific regulations. Next slide, please. So EPA has this information about biosolid use in their database called ECHO, which is their compliance database. Talks a lot about perhaps where biosolids are going and how they're being used. Primarily, we're seeing this as land application. So primarily, when you got a whole bunch of biosolids, you're going to be applying that to a farmer's field, where a contract hauler is going to be taking that away from you guys to apply somewhere else. About 22% are landfilled, 16% are incinerated. This could be a problem, as incineration that is incomplete can create products of incomplete combustion, which effectively means that PFAS can mobilize in the air when you incinerate it and possibly rain down 50 miles away. So incineration for biosolid use may become smaller and smaller as PFAS regulations come in. There's 11% that do other disposal. For the most part, you're going to see land application here. So you're going to see, PFAS may be applied to lands. Certain states such as Maine have banned biosolid use after a certain ceiling concentration. So they say after 150, you're not allowed to land apply anymore. It's causing a huge issue where people don't know where to send their biosolids. It's actually considered an emergency at this point. I don't anticipate that from Missouri. I don't anticipate that we're going to say, here's your ceiling concentration. After this, you're not going to be able to land apply. This is particularly going to be important for lagoons. So you might have biosolids from 20 or 30 years in your lagoon, which means that even if a facility has come and gone, even if a manufacturing facility is no longer with you guys, you're still going to have residuals of PFAS from when they were with you guys. It's going to become a huge problem. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you, but it's something to consider. Next slide, please. So per an EPA literature review in 2020, PFAS in biosolids is going to be variable. It's obviously going to be impacted by who discharges to you. Industrially impacted biosolids are going to have a lot more PFAS. Again, we believe that certain long chain PFAS, such as PFOS, are likely to have concentration in biosolids, which means that you're going to have a higher amount in biosolids in a smaller amount of biosolids. They may contain precursor products that break down over time. So you might have stuff that's not considered PFAS now, but then 10 or 20 years down the line, it turns into a mobile PFAS, something that is probably going to cause problems. Also important that animal manure may contain PFAS if there is a contamination of food or water source. So we're seeing this now, this concern about bioaccumulation up the trophic chain and what that means. Some initial studies are coming out now that say that eating fish that may be contaminated with PFAS may be providing a higher concentration to you than drinking contaminated water. We're going to have to see that for the future. Next slide, please. Preliminary research on PFAS says that it might be taken up by some food crops. So obviously you're not allowed to land apply biosolids within 45 days of harvest. But if you're applying this stuff to a field that's eventually going to be used for human consumption, that might be something to consider. Uptake is going to depend on the crop. So green leafy vegetables seem to have the highest uptake. All the health nuts that are saying that kale is super good for you might be eating their words, dependent on PFAS concentrations that we're seeing in kale. More plant uptake, you're going to see that more with shorter chain PFAS. So the ones that manufacturing facilities have said, these are probably safer. We're finding that they're probably not safer, and that they're creating issues like this where plants uptake them more. So the other issue is that even if the crops that you're applying biosolids on are not for human consumption, you could have animals that are eating this. So a lot of the times, we have huge amount of crop fields for feed. If you're land applying biosolids onto some crop that you're using for feed, and then you're feeding that to animals, the animals may have PFAS in their blood. So that means that they may have PFAS in their milk, in their eggs, in their meat. Currently, there are no federal or state testing requirements, standards, or approved analytical methods for PFAS in biosolids, soil, or plants. Draft Method 1633 is validated for use in biosolids and soil, but we don't have any methods for plants right now. And validated versus approved is going to be a little bit different. We'll discuss that in just a moment. Next slide, please. So generally, what's going to go in is going to come out. So at most POTWs, when you're going to have PFAS coming in, that's going to come out either in your discharge or in your biosolids. A Michigan study indicates source control reduces PFAS in biosolids 90 to 99%. So that means reducing the amount of PFAS that's coming into the treatment plant. This is going to be really important because a lot of the treatment technologies that are available right now preferentially are going to take pollutants. We're going to need to get that water extremely clean for these PFAS technologies to work. So for example, granular activated carbon is a well-studied way of removing PFAS. And some of you might actually already have this at your treatment facility. So you might have this to remove something like metals. This is a very well-studied material to use for treatment for PFAS. And it is very effective when the system is monitored closely. However, if you are using granular activated carbon to remove stuff like metals, it's going to take the metals first. So if you have a lot of metals in your effluent, you might be taking only the metals out and none of the PFAS. Another issue is that this does not destroy the PFAS. So your granular activated carbon is going to have PFAS in it after you've finished removing it from the water. And you're going to have to determine, what am I going to do with this media after I'm done getting the stuff out of the water? Next slide, please. There are some other well-researched pretreatment or treatment options. Ion exchange resins are highly effective, and the way that they work is they bind to the positive or negative ends of PFAS. But you have the same problem where media disposal is a PFAS waste. You also have a problem where these are considerably more expensive than granular activated carbon, particularly if you have a high volume of wastewater. Some of you might be familiar with reverse osmosis and nanofiltration. Again, if you're removing metals, this might be something you already have at your treatment facility. This is also a pretty expensive option, and again, produces a PFAS waste. Obviously, it's a lot more concentrated. It's in a smaller amount of water, but you're still going to have issues with removing and then destroying that PFAS. Next slide, please. So there are some proprietary methods for PFAS treatment. We're going to discuss mostly foam fractionation today. This is effectively a physical method of removing PFAS. So it agitates the liquid so that the foam that comes from the PFAS goes up the overflow and into a foam breaker. They skim that foam off, and this is more of a lower cost option, but it is not well studied. It's very much so a newer treatment. It also produces a waste product in the foam. It's obviously considerably smaller than the original water that you had to treat, but it is still a waste product. I've also seen some really, really new stuff about using some common reagents found in laboratories to break this stuff apart. That's by targeting the unbonded electrons on oxygen atoms of certain PFAS. Obviously, that doesn't work if there are PFAS that don't have oxygen atoms. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about what EPA currently recommends for disposal and destruction. Primarily, this is destruction. So after you have that PFAS waste, either from granular activated carbon, ion exchange resins, any of those treatment options, they're going to have a waste stream. What are you supposed to do with that final product? Effectively, EPA has said, we don't know what we want you to do with it yet, just store it. And that's because that's the most certain option. There are a lot of other options that EPA has, but we're really not sure how PFAS moves through these options. So 2 and 3 are effectively just injection wells. It's not uncommon where if we have a pollutant of concern that we really can't treat using conventional treatment technologies, we use natural attenuation to treat it. So effectively, you inject it into the ground, and over time, a small amount leaches over time, and that amount effectively cleans the area. The other last 2 options are going to be disposal in landfills. Obviously, if you've been paying attention, this could be a huge issue still. Landfill leachate's got to go somewhere. Generally, this could either be solid waste landfills with composite liners or hazardous waste combustors. That's going to be the last option there. If a landfill or injection is not a good idea, which for the most part, it's usually not, because again, you're going to have those issues with leachate. You're going to have those issues with possible attenuation not occurring in deep well injection. The least certain option that EPA recommends is hazardous waste combustors or other thermal treatment. And you might be saying, I've heard a lot about thermal treatment and pyrolysis and gasification. Why is this considered the lowest ranked option? It's because it's the most uncertain. So a lot of the time you have to heat this stuff up to over 1,000 degrees centigrade, right? You have to get it really, really hot, and that's really energy intensive. If you guys are not getting it to that level of heat that you need to be, what happens is that it gets released in the air as products of incomplete combustion. You've effectively aerosolized the PFAS. And what we found is that that stuff goes up in the air and then is rained down possibly 50 miles later. So you're moving the problem from one area to another, not necessarily removing or destroying it. EPA does plan to update this interim guidance this year. EPA does provide some ambitious timelines. So we're going to try to see if we can get this updated guidance this year, but if not, we can hopefully expect it next year. Next slide, please. So this was not finalized. It was open for public comment until February 2021. Again, they do intend to publish revised guidance every 3 years. So that should be this year. Again, the most common option that they'd like to recommend is 2 to 5 years interim storage. We just don't know what's going to happen if we use any of these other options to destroy PFAS. It's really uncertain, and we don't want to make what is already a large issue into an even bigger issue. Again, those recommendations are based off of levels of uncertainty. Next slide, please. Other federal actions. So right now what we have going on is validation for these test methods. What does that mean? Effectively, single lab validation means that they've tested it in one lab and they're certain that that method is effectively good for that one lab. There is multi-lab validation ongoing. So this means that several labs across the United States are working on ensuring that this method is appropriate. After we get multi-lab validation, we get approval. So that means that it goes into regulation into 40 CFR 136. After it goes into regulation, that's considered a best practice or the method that you want to be using the most. While we're still in these validation stages, it's not actually like a legal method. You are allowed to use it. I don't want to say that it's unallowed, but the results are not necessarily certain because we haven't had enough replication in labs. So that means that if you're using these methods, you have to be aware the method might change and the results that you might get are maybe not the best. Right now, what we're seeing during the multi-lab validation is that recoveries for these are pretty poor. We're having some difficulty with some of the method requirements. Effectively, because a lot of labs use PFAS in their lab equipment, small labs are probably going to be unlikely to be able to do this because they have to create an entire clean area, almost a clean room, to be able to do this stuff. They have to buy all new equipment. Unfortunately, PFAS is used in a lot of lab equipment. You have to get effectively a new machine because PFAS is used in this equipment, and you don't want to contaminate the sample. Because we're looking at such low values of PFAS, sample contamination can mean the difference between non-detect and you have a problem. There also was a PFAS Action Act of 2021. This was proposed and died on the Senate floor, unfortunately, but it does outline what EPA plans to do in the next 5 years or so, which drives the development of human health criteria, effluent limitation guidelines within 4 years, and requires industries to disclose pollutants to POTWs. There are some other requirements, but as this died on the Senate floor, we're not going to get into those. Next slide, please. What is really important to look at is the PFAS strategic roadmap that EPA has released. What this does is tells you exactly what EPA plans to work on in the next few years. So they're continuing to assess PFAS risks to health and the environment and ensuring a robust review process for new PFAS, as well as reviewing previous PFAS decisions. Effectively, what this means is that they're doing inventories and surveys for manufacturing facilities to determine how this stuff is used, what the concentrations generally are, and to generally get more information. As you might be aware of, there's a huge liability concern with a lot of these. So industries are pretty hesitant to voluntarily provide this information to EPA. EPA is going to require them through surveys to provide this information. So we're still pretty preliminary in the process. Additionally, through their ELG Plan Program 15, they plan to develop ELGs for industrial sources or additional regulations. Right now, what they're working on is for landfills, influence studies for POTWs for PFAS, as well as getting some additional inventories on textile mills. A lot of the time, PFAS are used to make things oil, water, and heat resistant. So you're going to see this in a lot of outdoor equipment. You're going to see this in a lot of like nonstick clothing, in a lot of your shoes. Textile mills have been really hush-hush about how they generally use PFAS because it's probably pretty widespread. We're also looking at landfills. So that right now they're trying to develop PFAS ELGs for landfills. We do anticipate that in the next few years or so. An ELG is a little bit different from like an aquatic life criteria in that as soon as that ELG is promulgated, as soon as that regulation is out, it applies immediately to that facility. So once we have an ELG, if the ELG says you can only discharge this much PFOA and PFOS from landfills, that's going to immediately come into effect, and we're going to have to probably reissue quite a few permits. Another very important step that EPA is taking is designated PFAS as a CERCLA hazardous substance. So what this means is that land application facilities, you might have some trouble. PFAS is also intended to be designated as a hazardous waste through RCRA, but that's going to take quite a bit more time. Right now, the focus is on CERCLA hazardous substances. Lastly, this is going to affect you guys probably the most. EPA does plan to publish ambient water quality criteria for PFOA and PFOS. They already have draft aquatic life criteria out right now, which we will discuss, I believe, on the next slide. So what is draft aquatic life criteria? What does this mean for you guys? Effectively, these regulations are promulgated based off of aquatic life criteria by EPA. So what happens is that EPA establishes this is the amount that we want to see in permits. At our triennial review of water quality standards, so every 3 years, the department determines what they want to add to our rules. Right now, what is really big in the mind of the department is going to be nutrients. So right now, we're currently in a triennial review period. Right now, we're focused on nutrients. I think that 2025 is our next triennial review period, and that's probably where we're going to focus on PFAS, especially because these draft aquatic life criteria are already out. EPA plans to promulgate these by the end of 2023. We're going to see if they meet that. Again, EPA tends to be quite ambitious with their timelines. Right now, what we're looking at is 49 milligrams per liter acute and 0.094 milligrams per liter chronic, or 94 micrograms per liter for PFOA. This might seem quite high to you guys, and that's because these are units that we typically use in NPDES permits. This is not looking at parts per trillion. For wastewater, we don't need to see as high of a level as removal as for drinking water. For one, we're not expecting people are going to be drinking wastewater directly. For PFOA, it's going to be 3 milligrams per liter acute and 0.084 milligrams per liter chronic. There are also fish tissue criteria, which we generally don't have for pollutants of concern in Missouri. So I'm not quite sure how we intend to promulgate those criteria. But there are also promulgated aquatic life criteria for fish tissue. Those are just going to be a little bit of a different implementation. As we alluded to before, interim drinking water health advisories or the proposed MCL that they just released, these are not applicable to wastewater. The only way that we would really promulgate health criteria would be if EPA promulgated human health protection criteria. That's the only health-related criteria we have for wastewater. Right now, it seems that the approach is going to be to try to protect the receiving stream. You might ask yourself, how do they determine these values? Well, if you're familiar with wet tests, we use Cereodaphnia dubio, which is a type of water flea, in our wet tests. And effectively what we do is we determine where deleterious effects occur. So when the animals start dying or when they stop being able to reproduce. They do the very similar thing. So they use a lot of different sensitive species, one of which is Daphnia magna, also a water flea. And they do modeling to determine how that might affect a receiving stream. Effectively, very similar to a wet test. So if you guys are familiar with those, you're familiar with this sort of derivation. Next slide, please. So we did develop a voluntary sampling program that we established in August of last year. I think that we might be going a little bit further or going away from this, instead going more toward BMPs and source reduction, but this program is still available. So if you guys are interested, please contact me and we will get you started here. Why we wanted to develop this sampling program is because we need to characterize PFAS in Missouri. We honestly don't have a lot of good data on how this stuff's being used in Missouri, and especially in regards to wastewater. Drinking water, they have done a crap ton of work, and Brent is going to present on that in just a little bit. But for wastewater, we don't have a lot of information about characterization. We also want to see how wastewater treatment facilities may affect concentrations. So if this stuff is actually getting concentrated in biosolids, it's good to know that because biosolid use very, very prevalent in Missouri. How does it benefit you guys? Well, you're going to be able to get ahead of regulatory drivers. This stuff is coming. At 100% it's coming. We don't know exactly when, 5 to 10 years from now, but it is coming down the line and it's going to be a multi-million-dollar issue. This is going to affect pretty much everybody. You're not safe, unfortunately. I can't say, you're a small facility, you're going to be fine. The stuff's it's in toilet paper. You're a domestic facility, you're going to have that. We're also going to try to help you ensure that whatever your chosen treatment technology is appropriate. So certain treatment technologies are better at removing certain PFAS. So granular activated carbon, for example, is better at removing those longer chain PFAS or legacy PFAS like PFOA and PFOS. If you have a lot of shorter chain, like for example, you have a metal finishing facility, they tend to use more shorter chain PFAS. That might not be a good treatment technology for you guys. Overall, we intend to both learn about PFAS and have better communication about these emerging contaminants. I personally believe it's really, really important to incorporate you guys into our regulatory process. Obviously, it's not your job and it might be something that you're not very familiar with, but if we don't incorporate stakeholder feedback, we might produce a program that doesn't work for stakeholders. So we really need your feedback and your help when we're developing these programs. Next slide, please. So what are the recommendations generally if you were to decide to go to this voluntary sampling program? This is extremely flexible. We don't have regulatory authority. We cannot require you to do so. So I can't say you need to take samples for this, and this PFAS. I can't say, you need to use this specific method for this many of your mediums. What we would prefer is quarterly sampling of all 40 analytes in EPA draft test method 1633. And we would prefer to have samples of influent, effluent, and biosolids, if applicable. If you're like a stormwater facility, obviously that's not going to be applicable for you. But for you guys, that's going to be applicable. However, unfortunately, this testing is quite expensive. So for all 40 analytes in 1633 for just one medium, so for example, just effluent, you might be spending $500 or $600, which means that if you were to actually do all of these recommendations, you might be spending an extra, $2,000 a year, $5,000 a year, really dependent on how many mediums you're going to be sampling. Next slide, please. For the most part, when we developed this program, people were not interested in it. And that's because, honestly, several reasons. One, there's a huge liability concern with this stuff. People are submitting this data to us, they're worried about that liability concern. Generally, what people are wanting to do is have a special condition that is source reduction. This would be required. So this would not be voluntary. This would be required. It would have to be in your permit. This is generally what stakeholders have preferred based off of our discussions and our work groups. The ultimate goal is going to be source reduction ahead of regulatory drivers. So by the time that you have these limits in place, hopefully you have very little PFAS that's actually going into your system. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about how is this going to be added into your permit? What's the process? It's going to be very similar to just a general renewal process. So when you renew your permit, you're going to get a welcome letter. That welcome letter is going to talk about initiatives. So one of the initiatives might be voluntary sampling. It might be pretreatment source reduction. After we've sent you that information, if you'd like to opt into voluntary sampling, or if the required pretreatment special condition is required, it'll be added to your permit. So we'll put that in your permit. You'll probably have plenty of opportunity to ask questions or if you have concerns about that, particularly if there's a financial concern. Please reach out to us. We can try to help you out there. After that, you collect the data, submit through the EDMR system, and then we do some data analysis, trying to determine where the highest sources of PFAS are in Missouri, what industries we need to be focusing on, as well as what treatment technologies are probably going to be best for you. Next slide, please. Implementation. So we are going to recommend this to all domestic sources that accept PFAS impacted industrial waste, metal finishing, landfill leachate, food packaging. We've already implemented this in some direct discharging permits for popcorn bags. Popcorn bags can have like 2,400 parts per trillion of PFAS just in the coating. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're eating that much, just means that it's present, as well as some airport permits we've implemented sampling in. This will be a special condition as well as have some fact sheet language. And we did develop a PFAS work group. This is a collaboration between DNR and expert stakeholders to develop our PFAS response. If you are interested in joining any of the sub work groups, please reach out to me. We can get you set up there. I think that we have 8 different work groups focused on a variety of different topics, such as biosolids, circle and RCRA, source water protection, permitting and pretreatment, which is my group that I would love to have you guys in. It's a very fun time. Please feel free to let us know if you have any questions or concerns, or if you want to add yourself to this work group. Next slide, please. So this is where we're going to talk about some cross-department collaboration. Missouri Department of Conservation has started to do some biota sampling. This is found in dead animal tissue samples. So deer, mussels, crayfish, fish, and waterfowl. They decided to do sampling in 9 counties based off of UCMR3 sites with the highest PFAS values. UCMR3 is a sampling program for drinking water treatment facilities, or just drinking water facilities. So like wells and stuff like that. We use that data to determine where we had the highest hits of PFAS and where we likely were going to have hits of PFAS in biota. That's going to be those counties that are in orange on your slide there. Newton County in the Spring River watershed, Franklin County, Perry County, Pulaski, Vernon, Platte and Buchanan, and Jackson and Cass counties. Those are generally where we're going to see that. For additional information, Katrina Knott is really, really knowledgeable, and she's the one that's heading up that study. So if you want to know what information they've already received from that study, feel free to contact her. So PFAS, it's a huge issue. It's a multi-industry, multimedia issue. It's a huge problem that we don't have any approved analytical methods for PFAS in wastewater or biosolids. Again, what we have is really validated methods that may change over time, and the data from those methods may or may not be good data. We also don't have any EPA-approved analytical method for precursor chemicals. And given that we have over 10,000 of these chemicals, there are some that don't even have names, right? So there's no chance we even have an analytical method to identify them. This is going to become a huge issue in the future, I believe. Next slide, please. There are some other challenges. We don't have any federal action levels or standards for biosolids in wastewater. So while some states are moving ahead and have determined that they're going to create ceiling concentrations at which biosolids can no longer be land applied, obviously we're seeing that that's a problem in a lot of these facilities. Now, it's causing emergency issues with being unable to get rid of your biosolids. The other thing is that presence in PFAS in wastewater and biosolids may not equate risk. So we're not anticipating that people are going to be directly eating biosolids, right? We're more concerned about bioaccumulation of biosolids on top of food crops or crops that are being fed to animals. Next slide, please. So with that, this is obviously a really huge issue, and it's going to be very big for a lot of facilities coming down the line. It's a multi-million-dollar issue, and we want to make sure that you guys are understanding what's going on and asking questions if you have them. It's best to be prepared for this stuff. It's coming down the line, so we need to make sure that we're thinking about that for the future. What questions or concerns do we have?
Wow, what a lot of information that you provided there in the last hour. That's a lot to think about. Getting up to speed on all this, kind of watching where this is going. That's important for operations and management, and for the boards and councils to realize that, you know, we got some challenges ahead of us.
it's going to be expensive no matter what, unfortunately. I wish I could say that there was an easy or inexpensive treatment option, or that, domestic facilities are going to be excluded, but unfortunately, I don't have the data to tell you that. So this is definitely something that you're going to want to talk to your city administrator about now, if you can.
Any questions out there in the water world? Jessica, we want to thank you for that presentation all morning long. And that's the best information, most complete information I've heard so far on the PFAS. So thank you as always for your participation and training to our membership.
Thank you for providing me the opportunity to share this information. This is something that I actually personally find extremely important and I personally care about. It's not something that I just do because it's my job. I do it because I really care, and I know that this is going to affect a lot of people. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share this stuff today.
Yeah, I think some of the boys are sending you a phone number, so I'll save that for you for later on. Any questions? Got some positive comments for you there on your presentation, Jessica. So I guess we're going to move into the drinking water side of talking about what's going on the PFAS field. And so Andy, can you do the announcements there and introduce our next speaker?
I certainly can. I tell you what, while we're switching over, give us about 5 minutes and then we'll be right back. So if you need to go grab something quick, feel free to go do so, and we'll be right back with you.
So we'll have this presentation on our website. Is that right, Andy?
Could you repeat that question? I was busy talking. Sorry.
The presentations this morning, will they be posted on our website?
They won't be. Yes. They'll be in downloads. More so, the recording of today's presentation will be on our YouTube channel, the MRWA YouTube channel. That'll be following. I won't give you a definite time when those will be available, but yes, they will be.
Thank you. So there is a question here. Will the department be sending a letter to the system that lists resources? Trying to get this thing to cooperate with me. Here you go.
Hi, this is Brent Weis with the Public Drinking Water Branch. Jess already stepped out, so I was going to try to take a whack at this one. So we do have a DNR-wide PFAS webpage that we have, and I'll actually go over this a little bit in my presentation here coming up, but kind of summarizes a lot of both our efforts at Missouri Department of Natural Resources and efforts EPA has taken to kind of assess the extent of PFAS contamination. And also, address this contamination. So we do have a centralized web page where you can find a lot of different resources. We have resources on, those workshop programs. That's it.
Okay. Chat.
So yeah, we're gonna put that link out in the chat. A lot of different resources on there. It's multimedia, has links to some of our drinking water resources, that voluntary wastewater monitoring program Jess had talked about. But I'll actually go over that webpage a little more in my presentation coming up.
Okay, we'll resume right at about 11 o'clock. So you just bear with us a moment. Okay, we're getting ready to jump back into the presentation. We have with us Brent Weis with the Department of Natural Resources Public Drinking Water Branch. Before we do that, I threw a thing in your chat box. It's a link to MRWA's open house page. We're going to have our open house April 19th here at the MRWA office in Ashland. You're welcome to attend that. We will have a Southeast Missouri style fish fry. It's usually a great time. We usually have around 80 to 100 folks. So if you're not doing anything on April 19th, come hang out with us. I'm going to turn things over to Brent.
All right. Hi there, guys. My name is Brent Weis. I am the Chemical Monitoring Coordinator at the Department of Natural Resources Public Drinking Water Branch. So what that means is I coordinate a lot of the sampling for your routine VOC, SOC, IOC monitoring. You might recognize my name. It goes out on all the sample instructions. If you've got questions about collecting your chemical samples, I might be the person you're going to end up talking to. But that also has led to me being tasked recently with kind of overseeing some PFAS monitoring in the state. So that is what I'm going to kind of talk to you about today. Let's go over some of DNR's past, current, and future actions regarding PFAS, at least as it pertains to the public drinking water program. All right, so Jess is always a very hard presenter to follow up. I will try not to repeat too much of what was already touched on in the previous presentations, but at least in some of these intro slides, it will probably happen to a degree. So what are these PFAS compounds? Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are a group of man-made compounds. There are thousands of compounds in this group, but they are characterized by the fact that they all contain a carbon chain surrounded by those fluorine atoms. These carbon-fluorine bond is extremely strong, extremely stable. And for this reason, these compounds do not easily break down and can be persistent if released to the environment. So much so that this actually led to them being affectionately coined as forever chemicals. So you can see here the length of the carbon chain, and as Jess kind of touched on, the difference in that terminal head is kind of differentiates these different PFAS compounds from one another. So this slide contains the chemical structures for PFOA on the left and PFOS on the right. You can see that both of these compounds contain 8 carbon in their carbon-fluorine chain, but they are differentiated by those differences in the terminal head. Essentially, the PFOS compound contains an extra sulfur and oxygen atom that is not present in that PFOA compound. And these little tweaks to that functional head can lead to the different desirable properties that have led to PFAS being so widely used. Go to the next slide. So I showed you PFOA and PFOS on the previous slide. These are some of the older and more widely studied PFAS compounds, but as we previously alluded to, this is a large group of compounds, over 10,000 probably in existence. So this slide here kind of is a family tree of sorts for these PFAS compounds. So you've got all these different 10,000 plus compounds that can kind of be broken down into groups based on variations in their chemical makeup. Next slide. These chemicals have been widely used in a lot of industrial processes and in manufacturing for a lot of consumer products. This is because of some unique properties that these chemicals have. They're non-stick, water resistant, grease resistant. And for this reason, they can be found in a lot of food packaging. So for instance, if you've ever eaten a pizza and wondered why all that grease doesn't soak through the bottom of that cardboard box, that is that PFAS coating on the interior of that box. Similarly, for treated fabrics, textiles, things like clothing, carpet, if you've ever spilled water on your clothes and immediately beads up or wicks away, that's generally a PFAS treated textile. Then other sources for these PFAS, or uses for these PFAS, I should say, include things like cleaning products, a lot of personal care products, shampoos, conditioners, bug sprays, sunscreen, cosmetics, all of this stuff that you might be putting on your skin all contain PFAS. And then, as we kind of touched on previously, they're still used in many industrial operations, chrome plating, electronics manufacturing, mining operations, oil recovery, things like that. So pretty widely used still even today. We can go on to the next slide. So some major sources of PFAS releases directly to the environment. So we kind of go over these on this slide. Primary largest point source for the release of PFAS is probably the use of firefighting foams. These are not the foams you would typically associate with, for instance, your household fire extinguisher. These are used to, fight large vehicle fires. They're used in plane crashes, oil or grease fires. And they're often associated with airports because they have been historically used in firefighter training at these facilities. So this is the stuff that, you've got a plane that's coming in, you're concerned about a crash landing, you coat the runway with this stuff to preemptively prevent any fires, which is, obviously great if you happen to be on that plane. But after the fact, all of that foam has to be washed off, and it can then end up in the environment and contaminate groundwater. So some other sources we've kind of already touched on how widely used these compounds still are in industrial processes and in the manufacturing of consumer goods. So discharges from these types of facilities is an additional source of PFAS to the environment. Landfills. So what happens with all these consumer products that contain PFAS when we're done with them? They're going to end up in the landfill. Once in the landfill, these products will break down. However, these PFAS compounds themselves do not. So they have a tendency to concentrate in that landfill leachate. Finally, wastewater treatment plant effluents. So again, I've kind of noted that these compounds are widely used in a lot of personal care products. So what happens when you take a shower and you rinse that shampoo or you rinse your cosmetics down the drain? These PFAS containing, or the PFAS contained in these products can end up at your wastewater treatment facility, where they are either directly discharged or concentrated into biosolids, which are then potentially land applied and can leach these compounds back into the environment. You want to go ahead to the next one. So why should we be concerned about PFAS? Recent studies by CDC and EPA have shown that at least some PFAS compounds have known toxicity. This, in combination with their persistence in the environment, their mobility in the environment, and the potential for bioaccumulation, suggests that potential adverse health effects or potential adverse effects for both the environment and human health. So for these same reasons, their ability, how mobile they are in the environment and their ability to bioaccumulate, PFAS can be found nearly everywhere. They've done studies that have found PFAS in polar bear tissue in the Arctic. They found PFAS on the top of Mount Everest. They found PFAS in every ocean on the planet. So this is a global problem. And because they're still widely used in so many consumer products and things of that nature today, most everyone alive has been exposed to these chemicals and probably continues to be exposed to these chemicals. I think Jess alluded to something like 98% of people have been found to have PFAS in their blood. And next slide. So for some of the health effects associated with exposure to high levels of PFAS, you have elevated cholesterol, liver issues, potentially thyroid disorders, IBS, cancer, and then developmental effects on unborn children. Additionally, people that have been exposed to PFAS can have those compounds detected in their blood, tissue, and even breast milk. So potentially a woman who is exposed to PFAS and is nursing could be passing on that exposure to her infants. So if you're interested in some more information on these health effects associated with PFAS, I'll take a second here to kind of plug this CDC guidance document they come out with a couple of years ago. This is a really good, or does a really good job of kind of breaking down the basics and then going into specifics about the actual health study where these effects were first observed. And I think it's useful because it has information for folks who are concerned they may have been exposed to PFAS. So you can frequently ask questions. You can take it, to your clinician. You can ask your clinician about, evaluate your level of exposure and potential risks that could be associated with that. So there's a link to this document on the slide, or you can also just find this by Googling the ATSDR PFAS clinician's guidance. It's an interesting read. It's only about 21 pages long, so you might look into that if you're interested in learning more about the actual health studies that went into some of this. I'm going to go on to the next slide. All right, so to help mitigate some of these potential health concerns, EPA has released health advisory levels for several PFAS compounds. Now, health advisories, what that means is until EPA makes a formal rulemaking, or for instance, establishes like an MCL, we'll be operating under these health advisories. However, health advisories are non-regulatory and non-enforceable. They're more meant to inform the public about the level of risk with these unregulated compounds. So essentially, they are based on a risk threshold of a 1 in a million chance of having adverse health effects, assuming a consumption of contaminated water over the course of a lifetime. So generally, this assumes you're consuming 2 liters of water a day over something like 80 years. And at what level will you expect a 1 in 1 million chance of having adverse health effects? Additionally, it takes into effect sensitive populations. So, for instance, immunocompromised individuals or children, which may be more susceptible to these health effects. So I guess the takeaway here is these lifetime health advisory levels offer a very high degree of public protection, and they're more equivalent to what we would call in the drinking water world an MCLG, and the fact that they're non-enforceable and non-regulatory, that they can kind of provide, help people make informed decisions about their drinking water. Want to go on to the next slide? So just for some history on these PFAS health advisory levels, EPA established the initial health advisories for PFOA and PFOS in 2009. These health advisory levels were set at 400 parts per trillion for PFOA and 200 parts per trillion for PFOS. They revised these health advisories in 2016 to a level of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, either combined or individually, so a significant reduction there. And finally, in June 2022, EPA released some further revised health advisory levels for 4 PFAS compounds. So you can kind of see on this slide here, those PFAS compounds that received new health advisories in last June. The ones that surprised us most out of this group would be the PFOA and PFOS health advisory levels. So you can kind of see in the far right column there, the minimum reporting level. That is essentially the level that labs have to verify that they can reliably and accurately sample down to or analyze down to receive certification from EPA to run these methods. So to get certified by EPA, a lab has to show it can analyze down to 4 parts per trillion reliably and consistently. The MCLs are, the health advisory levels proposed by EPA in June 22 for PFOA, for instance, was 0.004 parts per trillion. So these proposed health advisory levels were significantly below even what can be detected with our current technologies and methods right now, which did create some risk communication challenges when these health advisories were released. Next slide. So now that we've kind of gone through the background, what is PFAS? I would like to discuss some of the efforts Missouri has taken specifically to monitor for these compounds. Next slide. So we first sampled a subset of our public water supplies for PFAS under the third unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. So for those of you not familiar, the UCMR, the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, is managed by EPA and is meant to collect occurrence data on public water supplies nationwide, or on compounds in public water supplies nationwide that aren't currently regulated. So essentially every 5 years, EPA selects a group of 30 compounds that are not regulated already, and they do occurrence sampling of water supplies across the nation. And then they use data from this sampling to make informed decisions about if they should pursue additional rulemakings, like for instance, promulgating an MCL. So in 2013, under UCMR 3, we sampled all water systems in the state serving more than 10,000 individuals, along with a random subset of our smaller water supplies for several PFAS compounds, including PFOA and PFOS. Now, it's worth noting that at this time, the health advisory levels in 2013 for these compounds were 400 parts per trillion and 200 parts per trillion, respectively. So much higher than the current health advisories. And as a result, the minimum reporting level for this testing under UCMR 3 was much higher than our current minimum reporting levels. At that time, we were testing down to 40 parts per trillion for PFOS and 20 parts per trillion for PFOA. So while these minimum reporting levels were much lower than the health advisories at the time that we did this sampling, they are much higher than the current health advisories. So just a little caveat on this data here. But if you want to move to the next slide. This map is a summary of all of the detections that exceeded those health advisory levels under UCMR 3 nationwide. So you'll see we actually did not have any detections at that level under UCMR 3 in Missouri. Now you have to remember, like I said, we were testing at higher levels than we're testing at today, but at least at that time, we did not have any detections in the sampling. You can see there were much higher levels on the east and west coast. So while Missouri and Region 7 as a whole really came out pretty good at the end of this UCMR sampling, this testing did show that there was a PFAS problem if you're looking at a national scale. Go on to the next slide. So in 2016, EPA released their first revised health advisory levels for PFOA and PFOS. This is when they moved into that 70 parts per trillion, either individually or combined. In response to that, we contracted with MOS&T, Missouri University for Science and Technology, to do some additional sampling targeted at systems we thought to be most at risk for exposure to PFAS, based on the fact that they're in close proximity to a known source. So examples of these known sources would include things like airports, military bases, or manufacturing sites. You can kind of see in the top right corner of this slide, there's a list of a dozen or so systems that elected to participate in this sampling, and the justification for why they were selected is also listed there. So you can see, for instance, Nevada was selected for their proximity to a 3M manufacturing site, Noster with the Whiteman Air Force Base, Raleigh National Airport, known history of firefighting foam use, a lot of facilities around the Fort Leonard Wood area. So we really thought that we were going to be doing this sampling at what would be some of our worst case scenario type sites. We anticipated if we were going to have detections, this would be the systems we would see them at. So those sites are all represented by the green circles on the map. This map also contains the UCMR3 sampling data sites. So you can see, even at that time, we were starting to get a pretty good geographical distribution as far as the amount of sampling we've been doing across the state. Want to go on to the next slide. So here are the results from that special study. You will see right off the bat the detection limits at that under this sampling were much lower than they were under UCMR3. We were actually using a modified method the university had come up with that had allowed us to sample down to the sub-part per trillion level. So we were looking at much lower levels than we did under the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. While most of these samples were still no detect, the green boxes on these sample results summary table here, you can see that there was some low-level detections, all less than 2 parts per trillion. At this point, the health advisory levels for these compounds was still 70 parts per trillion. So we thought we were in really good shape here in Missouri with these detections at our worst case scenario sites being so low. We thought that was a good indicator as far as where we were in the state with PFAS. I'm going to play a couple more times. I think there's 11 minutes in animation, so 2 more. 1 more. Thank you. All right, so you see it kind of highlights some of the higher results we saw there, or at least detections we saw there. The results themselves are pretty low, but they were detections. It's also worth highlighting some other unusual data we got during this study. So you can see for facility number 7 and number 11 there, we had some unusual results where we took raw water samples that were no detect for PFOA and PFOS. However, we then took finished water samples that did have detections for either one or both of these compounds. So we were never really able to determine what exactly had caused this, if it was sampling error, or if there was something in the system or the treatment process that may have been contributing to these defects. This was a university study, so we had students going out collecting the samples. It's possible they stopped for lunch on the way out and they handled a food wrapper that contained PFAS. But it's also possible it could have been a local source of contamination at that sample tap. For instance, Teflon tape or a valve seat that may contain PFAS. We really aren't sure. But it does just kind of showcase how easy it is to get detections of these compounds when you're sampling at these sub-part per trillion levels. Go on to the next slide, please. All right, so this is an updated map after that that MOS and T sampling. So this is all of our data up through 2016. This also includes data for several other DNR programs, including our federal facilities group and our brownfields group. So there's a lot going on in this map, but it does provide a really good summary of all of our data up until that point, which would be 2016. So all the green and blue circles on this map represent drinking water samples that were non-detect. Thankfully, that's the majority of the symbols on this map. Yellow is the low-level detections that we found under that MOS and T study. And then I guess that would be like a peach and an orange or a pink symbols there are sampling essentially from other DNR programs. So this would be a lot of federal facilities, Air Force bases is where probably because of the firefighting foam use is where we tend to have seen the highest levels sampling across the state. So would be this sampling from our federal facilities group. So you'll see, for instance, Whiteman, Richard Gebauer, Rosecrans Air National Guard, Lambert Air National Guard. All these federal facilities are listed as detections on this map. And that is where the majority of the detections on this map is coming from, from those sites. On the next slide. All right, in 2022, EPA announced their intention to establish an MCL for several PFAS compounds. So in preparation for this, we enacted a voluntary monitoring program aimed at our smaller water supplies. The program offers small supplies the chance to collect a screening sample for 18 PFAS compounds. And this is meant to provide systems information on the levels of PFAS in their water so they can take steps to address this issue prior to this new rule becoming effective. So this first round of the sampling was aimed at systems serving between 2001 and 3,000 individuals. Nearly 100 systems participated in this sampling, and they're represented by the blue circles on this map. I'm going to go on to the next slide. The second phase of this sampling was offered to supplies serving between 1,000 and 2,000 individuals. Again, slightly more than 100 systems participated in this phase of the sampling. Again, they are represented by the blue circles on this map. We are gearing up for the next round of this voluntary monitoring. We're going to be reaching out to systems serving between, we're still finalizing the list, but we anticipate it'll be somewhere around 300 to 999 individuals for the next phase of sampling, probably something like 200 to 300 supplies, somewhere in that range. So if your system falls into that group, we may be reaching out to you soon to try to coordinate some sampling. I want to go on to the next slide here. So you may be wondering, well, when do the large systems get to participate in all this fun? Enter UCMR 5. So UCMR 5 was recently announced by EPA that it will include sampling nationwide for 29 PFAS compounds. They will sample all systems serving more than 3,300 individuals, which is a change from previous UCMR. They're going to be sampling lower population groups. They've also significantly reduced the minimum reporting levels for these compounds under this sampling. So, I mentioned it was 20 and 40 under UCMR 3, 20 and 40 part per trillion. The minimum reporting levels for PFOA and PFOS under UCMR 5 is down to 4 parts per trillion. So UCMR 5 is just going to be a significant improvement over UCMR 3 in a number of ways. We're just sampling more systems for more compounds at much lower levels. While some of this UCMR 5 sampling did start this year, some systems may have started collecting as early as or as soon as January. The majority of this sampling is going to take place during the 2024 calendar year. Want to move on to the next slide? So now I'm going to talk briefly about what we're doing with all this data and how we're keeping the public informed about PFAS testing in their community. So all of our data has been made publicly available through our Missouri PFAS Map Viewer webpage. You want to click on this animation? Thank you. So when you get to this map viewer, you're going to be greeted with a disclaimer. It's easy to just click through these, I know, but there is one important note in this disclaimer here. The dots on this map are generated at the approximate center of the public water system service area. They do not represent the exact geographical location that these samples were collected. So we've gotten calls from folks concerned. They say, hey, I see that there's been PFAS connections in my neighbor's next door yard. Well, that's not the case. It was in the public water supply well. So important disclaimer there. If you want to go on to the next slide here. You can also probably should pay attention to the About section on the left side of the map viewer. This is a lot of general information on it. The map viewer is updated weekly, so it's not real time, but very close with most recent sample results for our public water supplies. There's also a link in that About section to the Drinking Water Watch website. So if you're interested in getting sample results for compounds other than PFAS, I'll take a second to just plug Drinking Water Watch right now. That's a great resource for our water systems. If you're not familiar with it, all of your compliance sampling result data, including all of your historical results, are available through that website, along with other information about your public water supply and your sampling schedules. So it can be a great resource for our public water supplies. Back to the mapping tool here. how this essentially works is it the most recent PFAS results for a public water supply against the health advisory levels that EPA has established. So you can see in that about section, it lists out those health advisory levels and the symbols used to represent these systems on the map. So basically any system that has had a result that exceeds one of the health advisory levels for the 4 compounds listed there is going to be represented by a red diamond. Systems with detections of one of these compounds that do not exceed those health advisory levels are going to be represented by an orange square. And finally, systems with no detect results are going to be represented by the green circles. I think the biggest takeaway from this map viewer should be that while we are seeing some localized PFAS contamination here in Missouri, the vast majority of our samples are coming back no detect. This slide's likely a little dated. I suspect if you went to our map viewer page today, you would see even more green on that map. Maybe a few more red as well, but we're definitely adding the greens faster than we are adding the detections. So, you know, and I did just crunch some numbers for the sampling we have done so far under this voluntary monitoring program. Something like 93% of our samples have come back no detect. So I think that should be an important takeaway from the sampling effort so far. Back to it though, when you do click on a symbol for a system here in the map viewer, you're going to get a little pop-up with some general system information. So you can see the one that we are highlighting on this slide is for the Portageville Public Water Supply. It lists their public water system ID. You can see the location where that sample was collected from. In this case, it's well number 10. You can see the date that sample was collected. And then it also provides for the 4 health advisory compounds a summary of the most recent results and the historical high results for these compounds. Another important thing to note is you'll see at the top of that information box, there's a couple little white arrows that got the big red arrow pointing to them right now. You can use these arrows to cycle through different sources. So for instance, if you were to click the right arrow on this slide here, or if you're on the viewer, you know, we're looking at the results for well number 10 now. That would bring up the results for instance, well number 11 or something of that nature. So that's an important thing to note. If you have multiple sources, you might have to utilize those arrows at the top of the information box to see results for all of your wells. If you want to go on to the next slide. We also had a useful report generation tool built into this web viewer. So if you're interested in getting more detailed information, this is a good place to go. You click on the R symbol in the upper right corner of the map viewer webpage, and it'll bring up this generate PWS report box. From there, all you need to do is enter your public water system ID number into this box. If you're not sure your water system's ID number, as I kind of discussed previously, you can get that from the information box that we kind of looked at on that last slide. So once you enter your MO number there, you're just going to click run. It's going to think for a couple minutes, but it will eventually generate a report for you. If you want to go on to the next slide here. So it's going to summarize all of that general information that you had in the pop-up box. Your system name, system ID, you're going to get a real nice map, population served, things like that. The second page is going to be a summary page. And what this has is results for all the health advisory compounds at all locations sampled, kind of like a one-stop shop. So for instance, for the 4 compounds that you have health advisories for, you can see at this system, we've collected systems from the distribution, samples in the distribution system, samples from the treatment plant effluent, and samples from the well. And this is going to summarize on the first page the most recent results of that sampling and the historical max result for that sampling at all the locations that we've sampled. Now, if you want to click on to the next slide, if you want to scroll down to the next page, you're then going to get a very detailed breakdown of all the sampling we've done at that public water supply, for all the analytes we've tested for, even all those non-detects. So you can see, depending on the number of sources your system has, and the amount of sampling we've done out there, when you've got all these non-detect results, this can just be pages and pages worth of data. So these reports can get rather long, but if you're interested in, seeing everything we have, this is a really good tool for you to use to do that. You want to click into the next slide. Another way you can kind of get access to this data is through the viewer's ability to export data to Excel for review and manipulation. So when you go to the map viewer page, you're going to see a gray arrow at the bottom of the screen. If you click that arrow, it's going to bring up a data table view. And then click one time for me for the animation. If you click options on that data table, it's going to give you the option to export all of that data. So once downloaded, you'll get this nice Excel document. They're really useful because once you've got it in Excel, you can easily manipulate that data. You can sort it, filter it to achieve whatever you are trying to do. The other thing that is really useful for this data table view that you don't get from that report generation tool is this actually has the ability to extract data for multiple water systems or even the state as a whole, all into one large spreadsheet. So, you can kind of see here we've extracted data from multiple water supplies, but then in the click of one or two buttons, you can then sort all of that data, thousands of results, and you can see all your defects in one, summarized list. So if you're handy with Excel, there is a lot you can do with this tool. I would recommend playing with it. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback from folks with how easy this makes it to extract and manipulate that data. We'll go on to the next slide. So, as I kind of just touched on briefly, we do have a MDNR PFAS webpage, and you can find a link to this map viewer on that webpage, in addition to a lot of other resources. So you can see at the bottom of the page there's a tab for the MDNR actions. So it kind of summarizes things we're doing in Missouri to assess the extent of PFAS contamination and to address PFAS contamination. And it's also got a tab for EPA actions they've taken on a nationwide scale to do the same. And go on to the next slide. And just to kind of summarize some of the resources on this site, there is obviously that link to that drinking water monitoring PFAS viewer tool and all of our drinking water data. But there's also information on the voluntary wastewater sampling that Jess talked about in her presentation. There's information about funding opportunities for public water supplies who may be impacted by PFAS contamination. Information on those PFAS work groups that Jess had touched on in her presentation. And finally, the final thing there is a PFAS inventory tool. It's something we're working with our Superfund team to develop. And essentially what this is a tool that uses industry material handling codes to try to identify facilities that may have used or continue to use PFAS compounds. So this isn't a perfect tool, still being developed, but once it's finished, it may help us to kind of narrow down the sources of PFAS contamination. So for instance, say if we have a drinking water well that we're having detections of PFAS compounds in, we can go back to this inventory tool. And if we see, well, there's a metal finishing facility a quarter mile away, we might know where that PFAS is coming from. So still in development, but it's an interesting tool we're working to put together there. All right, so what are your options if you do find your public water supply is impacted by PFAS contamination? There are treatment options that can remove these PFAS compounds from your drinking water. These include activated carbon treatments, ion exchange treatment, and membrane filtration. So for instance, like a RO treatment system. Which treatment technology might be best for your public water supply is going to vary depending on the PFAS compounds which have been detected. I think we've kind of touched on it previously, but some of these technologies are better at removing certain compounds than others. It's also important that you consider the difficulty of managing the waste stream with your selected treatment option. So for instance, RO creates reject water in which contaminants can be highly concentrated. So you might have to take special precautions to discharge this waste stream. Spent resin from your ion exchange treatment system needs to be handled like a hazardous substance and properly disposed of. Carbon from your GAC can be heated to very high temps in an attempt to incinerate any PFAS that might have bound to that media. However, there is still some uncertainty about what temperature you need to reach to fully incinerate these PFAS compounds. And if you're not heating it enough, you may just be re-releasing these compounds through air emissions and depositing them around your facility essentially. So if not properly disposed of, these waste streams can end up back in the water and the PFAS cycle continues. Kind of going to the slide. So far this has all been really bad news. Do we have any good news for you? I do actually. Recently, the bipartisan infrastructure law and some other funding opportunities like the America Rescue Plan were approved and have made a lot of federal monies available to address emerging contaminants in drinking water. So to qualify for this funding, you have to have results showing detections of an unregulated contaminant in your drinking water. That would include detections of any of these PFAS compounds. So systems that do find PFAS contamination are encouraged to coordinate with our Financial Assistance Center and take advantage of this 100% grant funding opportunity. The contact info for Lauren Grassley is on that slide there. She is the point person for this BIL funding and is a great resource if you've got additional questions about that. But this is also a good reason for systems to participate in our voluntary sampling program. You know, it's sometimes you might not want to know, but it's better to know now when we're in the early stages of this rule development than to know in a couple of years that you've got a PFAS problem and this rule's been finalized and you've got EPA involved and you've got required actions. So next slide. So that is a little bit about our past and current efforts to address PFAS. But what should water systems expect over the next couple of years moving forward? Well, on March 14th, just a week or so ago, EPA announced they were working on finalizing the proposed rule language for a PFAS national primary drinking water rule. Let me click on the next slide. So what would this rule require? This rule would set legally enforceable limits for 6 PFAS compounds, or essentially NCLs for 6 PFAS compounds, in addition to establishing non-enforceable MCLGs for these 6 compounds. So PFOA and PFOS are proposed to be regulated as individual contaminants, and then 4 additional PFAS compounds are proposed to be regulated as a mixture. Move on to the next slide. So here are the proposed MCLs. You can see PFOA and PFOS are both proposed at 4.0 parts per trillion. And then PFNA, PFHXS, PFBS, and GenX would be evaluated as a mixture. So essentially what you would do for those 4 compounds is you would plug the concentrations of those chemicals into an equation. That equation is going to produce a hazard index value. And that hazard index value cannot exceed 1.0 or the system would be in violation of the MCLs for those compounds. On to the next slide. Some other general requirements under this rule is that it would require monitoring for these PFAS compounds at all of our community and non-transient, non-community public water supplies. It would require systems to notify the public if they have detections of these PFAS compounds through your consumer confidence report. And it would require systems to implement treatment if they found levels of these PFAS which exceed the proposed standards. So it's important to note, like I said, this rule came out about 10 days ago, so it's very early in the process for this rule development. However, EPA will then be giving an opportunity for public comment on various aspects of this rule. So once they complete public comment, they can finalize the language. And EPA anticipates once this rule is fully implemented, it could prevent tens of thousands of serious PFAS attributable illnesses or deaths. I'm going to click on the next slide. The 400+ page pre-publication document can be found on EPA's docket website. This will eventually be replaced by the final publication or the final proposed rule language. And when that happens, that will start that 60-day clock for the public comment period. Want to go on the next slide there? So despite that, EPA has already started to do some public outreach as far as communicating the requirements of this new rule. They've got several webinars scheduled. The first was on March 16th, 2023. It was just aimed at some overview of some of the general requirements of this rule. We've also got one coming up on March 29th. It's aimed more at water utilities, and it's supposed to be more technical in nature. So that March 16th webinar was recorded. Was recorded and it is available on EPA's website. And you can register for the March 29th webinar on their website as well. I would recommend the utilities to attend that. EPA also has a public listening session coming up on May 4th. So during this 60-day public comment period, EPA is encouraging folks to participate in these public outreach efforts and to let EPA know your thoughts and or concern with this proposed rule language. Want to go on to the next slide? We have only started at PNR going through the 400+ page pre-publication in addition to all the supporting documents that EPA put out last week. However, in our initial review, we have come up with several areas where we're going to be making comments ourselves to EPA. And I'll go over these a little more in depth over the next couple of slides. You want to advance? So firstly, there's a requirement in this rule that systems should be sampling quarterly with at least 90 days apart. So there are already concerns about lab capacity with this rule because these are relatively difficult methods to run. However, the way this rule is written kind of exacerbates that issue for at least for states like Missouri, where we provide analytical services. It kind of complicates our ability to stagger this sampling out over that 3-month monitoring period. So for instance, if we were looking at first quarter, just for an example, we would typically want to sample a third of our supplies in January, a third in February, and a third in March. This helps even out the workload at the lab. However, the way the rule is written currently, you could complicate that. So for instance, if you were a March sampler, I'm sure this has never happened to anybody out there, but if you get your kit in March, maybe it gets set aside, forgotten, and you don't collect it until March 31st. Well, the way the rule is written with that 90-day requirement, there's really no mechanism to get back on a better schedule. You wouldn't be eligible to collect your next sample until the end of June. And if anything happened at that point, you only have a couple of days to get that sample. There is no cushion. You're just going to be in the next month, that next quarter, and you're going to have a monitoring violation. So it's going to lead to a lot of our systems wanting to do their sampling early on in the quarter, which is going to lead to issues at our lab with staff there essentially pulling their hair out the first month of the quarter and twiddling their thumbs for the next 2 months. So we're going to be asking EPA for some common sense flexibility in that requirement, just because for folks like us who at DNR, we're coordinating sampling for a large number of public water supplies, if we're not allowed some common sense flexibility, it's just going to kind of exacerbate that lack of capacity concern. This next piece of rule language here is pretty standard language for a drinking water rule. This is just establishing that the minimum reporting levels for these compounds, when I click, I think there's 2 animations twice. So basically anything less than these levels should be considered no detect and treated as a 0 for compliance determination, compliance purposes. Pretty standard. You all are probably familiar with this from a lot of our other rules.
Sorry.
However, if you go a couple pages further in that document, you will see this table, which seems to suggest maybe we should be using data below these minimum reporting levels to determine how frequently systems should be sampled. So for instance, this table indicates you may reduce monitoring if your system has a PFOA running annual average of less than 1.3 parts per trillion. Well, the minimum reporting levels for PFOA, as established by EPA on the previous slide, is 4 parts per trillion. So if anything under 4 is a no detect, how can we ever verify that a system is meeting this 1.3 part per trillion trigger level? Unless EPA expects us to use qualified data less than those minimum reporting levels for this purpose. And just for some background, anything below allows minimum reporting level should be treated as an estimate and an approximation. It will not hold up to QA/QC checks. For this reason, we've never really used this qualified data for compliance purposes before, and we don't believe it would be appropriate to do so now. So that's going to be one of our comments, just asking for clarification on this aspect of the rule from EPA. Final concern we came up with is concerns about the analytical methods that are allowed for analysis of these compounds. So essentially, to get certified to run PFAS samples by EPA, you are given a proficiency sample, or proficiency test, a sample with a known concentration, and you're required to report plus or minus 30% of that known concentration. So that means if you have a lab that's biased high and reporting 70% of that, or I'm sorry, a lab that's biased low and reporting 70% of that true value, and a lab that's biased high reporting 130% of that true value, they're both going to pass that proficiency test, but there can be a 60% deviation in those results. So anytime you have this much variability allowed in the method, it can lead to systems kind of, one, not necessarily trusting these results, and two, thinking that maybe they can shop around for different labs for the best results. Like 3 or 4 times. So for instance, if you're a water supply and you're selecting between lab A here and lab B, lab A consistently biases a little high, lab B consistently biases a little low. You know, you are right at a compliance level like an MCL, lab B is going to be more likely to keep you in compliance. Now I'll say this isn't working with labs every day. This isn't a real world scenario. Sometimes they're a little high, sometimes they're a little low. But that can further complicate things when you have an MCL level so close to a minimum reporting level. 2 more clicks for me. So for instance, if you have lab C here, sometimes they're biased a little high, sometimes they're biased a little low. If you give them a sample of 4 parts per trillion PFOA, depending on, you know, the analyst or the instrument or just the day, they might report that sample biased slightly low. So that would be less than 4 parts per trillion or no detect. Or they might report that sample as slightly biased high, which would exceed 4 parts per trillion, or would be an MCL violation. In reality, the true concentration of that sample is 4 parts per trillion exactly, neither an MCL violation or a no detect. It would be a detect that does not exceed but is equal to the MCL. So you can see where this could create issues, and we are going to be asking EPA to kind of rein in these acceptance limits a bit to help address some of that. Next slide. All right, so what's next? Just to recap, EPA has proposed MCLs for 6 PFAS compounds. Once they publish the final proposal on their docket, that will start the clock for the 60-day public comment period. DNR will be providing comments during that public comment period. And after that public comment period closes, EPA does have 18 months to address the public comment and finalize their rule language. EPA has indicated they do not want to use that full 18 months. They want to have this finalized rule language out by fall of 2023 or later this year. Personally, I think that's a little optimistic. Probably something early 2024 is more realistic. However, the takeaway here should be that EPA is working to get this rule done as quick as they possibly can. So if we are looking at finalized rule by the end of 2023 or early 2024, that will give states 3 years to implement this new rule and gain primacy. So we're looking at an initial effective date for this rule as probably somewhere around 2027. All right, and that's basically sums up our PFAS monitoring efforts and what's coming up on the drinking water side. If anyone's got questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer those now.
Okay, pile in there with those questions if you've got any. You got contact information there as well. I'm sure Brent will take phone calls if you got specific questions down the road.
Absolutely.
We want to thank Brent and Jessica for this great training that you've provided today. This has worked out really well. We are going to repeat this on the 9th day of May. So for those of you attending that want to get some of your decision makers in on some of this exposure, you might want to think about the 9th day of May. It'll be of the morning, and we're going to go through this again. This training is not going to go away. So we'll be exposed to a lot of information over the next few years on this. Any questions out there? Good positive comments coming back from the attendees. Listen, if you haven't provided your license number alongside of your name on the chat, why, there's maybe a few people that I don't have the license numbers for. So if that happens to be you, you might want to chime in.
Oh, we did have a question. Outside the water and wastewater industry, is anyone going to try to get plastic bags, bottles, and containers to go away, go back to glass?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. Microplastics could be the next big thing in the drinking water world. We'll have to see.
Any other questions? Hey, reiterating what Gary had said, please put your name and your certification number along with your system and your job title in the chat if you have not done so. We had 42 people on screen, but we have 57 people that are actually with us. So
I have a question.
yes, Matthew.
Do you know of what about medications? Is the material around medications like capsules, do they contain PFAS or anything that you know of?
You know, I am not familiar with that aspect of use. I suppose it's possible, but that's not a source I'm familiar with.
You'd think that would have to dissolve somehow.
Well,
Capsules.
well, if it's in, Well, that's my question. It could be, I mean, literally lots of PFAS could be flushed down the toilet every day if medications such as plastics encapsulate, medications. I was just more or less curious.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that as a large source of PFAS. But I suppose it could be another one of those small contributors.
So is it possible the rubber tires in the landfills? I mean, that's a contributor as well.
Any PFAS containing products that end up in the landfill are definitely contributing to PFAS and that landfill leachate. So that could include anything that's waterproof, stain resistant, all sorts of grease resistant, all sorts of different applications. So as those break down, those products do break down. However, those PFAS chemicals themselves do not. So yeah, absolutely, that could be contributing. And all that PFAS is then being concentrated in that leachate from all those different sources, whatever that might be.
Well, we're just over on time. This has worked out great. We want to thank everybody for attending the training today. Thank Brent, Jessica for coming up here and providing this great training for us. And we will see you all down the road in our training events. So keep your eye on our website. And all of our training is posted there. Got anything, Andy?
No, sir.
That's all I have.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks again.